So this will be the third and final installment of our study of Merleau-Ponty, and we're going to be talking about chapters 5 and 6 from part 1 of the Phenomenology of Perception. So just quickly thinking back of what we did before, in the first Merleau-Ponty lecture, we really brought out this notion of the habitual body and the way that our engagement in a meaningful world is established, below the level of our self-conscious reflection in the developed, habituated bodily relationship we have with things. And then in the next meeting, our second meeting, we worked on filling out something about the way that world that we live in is articulated through the terms of time and space. So we looked at the lived time and lived space, the temporal and spatial dimensions or terms of that world that lies behind and in a sense below the everyday world of our ego life. What we're going to do now is look a little bit more at that and a little bit more about what's actually going on in that habit world. Like what is it that what's it about? What are our lives about beneath the surface of our explicit self-consciousness? So I said we're going to do 2 chapters. We're going to do chapter 5, which is about sex, and chapter 6, which is about language. Sex and language are obviously huge and rich topics each in their own right, and Merleau-Ponty's chapters, insofar as they address those things, are also huge studies in their own right. But we're only going to take them up. We're going to take them up in pursuit of a particular theme, and that is the way our engagement with sexuality, our engagement with language, and engagement with other people. So we're going to be looking at the phenomenology of sexual experience and language experience as aspects of the phenomenology of our experience of other people, and that's what Merleau-Ponty does. So I'm not making something up. I mean, this is the trajectory of the book that I'm trying to follow. But that means that there are depths to the exploration of sexuality and language that we could pursue with the help of his book that we're going to skirt a little bit, just to zero in on the point I'm after. So that's what we're going to do. First, I'll talk about chapter 5 on sexuality, and then I'll talk about chapter 6 on language. So chapter 5, in Don Landis's translation, he entitles it "The Body as a Sexed Being," which is okay. I mean, that French word is sexué. That's literally correct. But I think this translation can be a bit misleading. The Colin Smith's older translation was "The Body in a Sexual Being," and I think, though that doesn't directly correspond to the words in quite the same way that Don's as a sexed being does. I think in some ways it captures the sense of the chapter a little bit better, because he's not talking about this. His phenomenological interest is not focused on an entity that has a specific sex, and that's how in the modern day we often talk about sex. We say you're sexed, meaning you have this one or that one or something like that. And to say as a sexed being makes it seem like we're talking about an entity, a thing. Whereas I think that what he's really meaning to talk about is our way of being. He's not talking about us as a sexed entity in the world. He's talking about how we, as Dasein in Heidegger's term, as experiencers, exist. And he's talking about when he says the sexed way we exist, he means the way we exist as beings who are sexually motivated or sexually engaged. So I would stick with that older translation myself, "The body as a sexual being," regardless of how you translate it. That's what we're about. So in this chapter, that's what it's about. So we're going to focus on what it is to exist sexually. That's really what the chapter is about. and so in a way, it's asking, uh, uh, what is sexual existing in the analogous way to the way that the previous chapter asked, what is it to exist spatially? What is spatial existing? Not exactly the previous chapter, and we skipped over the short chapter 4 called The Synthesis of One's Own Body, which is a nice little chapter. It's very pleasant to read, and it kind of pulls together a few things. But it doesn't particularly add a new domain of study, I don't think. But our last study was spatiality, so now we're going to do sexuality. So we want to think about, well, we have to get the phenomenon of sexuality in view. In the book, the section B, being in a sexual situation, runs from 158 to 160, and that's the most basic description of the core phenomenon or the core experience of sexuality that Merleau-Ponty gives and that we're working with. And I'm going to draw quite a bit on that. In other words, my talking about this chapter is largely going to focus on a couple of paragraphs at the beginning, but you can get a lot out of it. So when you're reading, don't just rip through the chapter and try to get to the end thinking that the good stuff is back there. Focus on this section first and try to get what he's saying here, because then I think if you get this well, then you can move into the other stuff pretty effectively. Well, let's say the first sentence of that. He says, pathology reveals a living zone between automatic reflexes and representation, in which the sexual possibilities of the patient are elaborated. So he says pathology reveals, well, in the preceding page, he's probably alerted us to the fact, yeah, he's been talking about Schneider again. Schneider was the patient, Gelben Goldstein maybe, who we talked about before, who could grab his nose but couldn't point to it. The guy with the brain injury, who's a subject of studying a lot of these things. And Schneider's pathological spatial experience allowed us to understand something about what spatial experience is normally like, and the same is true with his sexual experience. By seeing the problems and the breakdowns that happen in his sexual experience when he has this injury and so on, we learn something about what sexuality is like in normal life, in everyday life. I don't think I'm going to particularly talk about Schneider. It's pretty easy to read. I might come back to it, but but that's what he means when he says pathology. Pathology reveals. Schneider's case reveals to us that for the normal person, there is a living zone between automatic reflexes and representation. So, people, if you think, how do people think about sex? Well, we tend to rely on that same kind of mind-body dualism that I was saying we rely on when we were talking about the phantom limb. We start off thinking about ourselves as detached, self-reflective, self-conscious egos, reflective egos who choose for ourselves and deploy our action on an already existing objective world. Now, those are the terms in which we normally think about our experience. But what we have been seeing is that kind of experience rests upon a different kind of experience, which we studied with the habit body, with live time, with live space, and so on. A different kind of experience that is the establishing of the world in which that kind of experience is possible. And the terms of that subterranean world, so to speak, that world that falls outside of our reflective consciousness, that is not itself structured and organized in the same kinds of terms that the world of the ego in relationship to the object is structured. But when we do think in that ego object way, we tend to think in terms of, is it coming from my mind or is it caused by the world, right? We tend to flip back and forth between the terms of a mind-body dualism. And so in that case, if we think about what sexuality is, we will often think of it either as, he says, what we're going to find is a zone between automatic reflexes and representation. So we typically think of it as an automatic reflex or representation. We tend to fall back on thinking of it as a natural function that's kind of automatically forced upon us. Or on the other hand, as an idea or something that we really choose. And if we went back and looked at Schneider's case, like that's sort of what Schneider falls back on. Like his sexual life isn't sexual in the way that a normal a non-damaged person's experience typically would be. He basically, we would say at a core level, he's not sexual. There's no erotic dimension to his life, no romantic dimension to his life. So he can go back and forth between two things. There is a very primitive, basic bodily function of erection and ejaculation in his penis and so on, and he can think about another person and whether that other person is a good person or not. And so he's got those two things he can have. Like he doesn't seek out any kind of sexual activity, and he's not imaginatively engaged by it, but his body can still function in those ways, and he can ejaculate. And so, so in that sense, there is something bordering on an automatic reflex that happens in him. But in him, that experience is not very interesting to him, and has nothing else really attached to it. And on the other hand, he can, if you ask him, is someone attractive or not, all he can really do is say, well, I understand that person to be a nice person, or something like that. So in other words, he's got something that's almost automatic reflexes and representation. He shows you what it would be like if your sexuality were a matter of those things, and it would be basically the complete absence of sexuality. So sexuality, on the contrary, Merleau-Ponty says, is a living zone between automatic reflexes and representation, in which the sexual possibilities of the patient are elaborated. So we're looking at the same kinds of things we've been looking at before. We're looking at being in the world. We're looking at something that is going to be a dimension of bodily responsiveness to environmental motivations that carry out for us our inhabitation of a meaningful world. But that happens below the level of our explicit reflection. So, in as much as it happens below our reflection and is something that in a sense we undergo passively, something we don't choose, we experience it as if it were a necessity. So that's how, from the point of the ego, it can seem like nature causing us. And yet, on the other hand, compared to nature, the ways we act obviously reflect psychological dimensions, personal, interpersonal, familial, cultural, and all the rest. And so in that way, compared to strictly natural causal phenomena, this looks more like a matter of representation, right? So you can see why the realities of sexual experience, in a sense, look like nature, and in a sense look like freedom, or what's the better word, mind or self-consciousness, something like that, and yet their reality fits into neither of those dualistic categories. So once again, we're going to be at that level of a bodily intelligence, or a bodily intentionality, as he calls it, a way of being directed towards something, a way of being oriented to engagement with the world that is lived out and lived through your body, the bodily connection. So that, that's roughly what we're going to be, what we're talking about. And so I want to go through just a few of the things he says here in 158 to talk about the nature of that bodily intentionality. What kind of bodily coupling with the world is it, or what's it about, or something like that. Merleau-Ponty links the story of sexuality to the theme of affective life. That would be, I guess, on page 157. He says, if we're going to reveal the genesis of being for us, we must ultimately consider the sector of our experience that clearly has sense and reality only for us, namely our affective milieu. And then a little bit later, he says, affectivity is usually concerned with the mosaic, da, 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 da. So right up near the bottom of 156 and the top of 157, he right off the bat, talking about sexuality, he's raised the theme of affectivity or emotion. And I wanted to pick up on that for a second to get you to think about this, right? So in that in that habitual world we inhabit non-reflectively, that inhabitation that is the presupposed and generally inconspicuous background and platform for our ego life. That world is not a neutral world. So we already saw that in some sense when we talked about lived space, and we talked about the way that our relation to space is situational, not positional, which means it's oriented by familiarity and alienation, right? That, you know, there's a real marking out of the places where I feel at home and the places where I don't, and so space is not a neutral set of indifferent positions. It's got this fundamental organizing relationship that is about, you know, where I belong, where I don't belong, where I can go to, where I return to, where I go from, and that orientation is lived in a significant way affectively, where it's where you feel comfortable and where you don't. So we've already seen that affectivity, or let's just say affectivity. Affectivity is the domain, or the stuff of that part of life. But the affective orientation is a little richer than just where I'm at home and where I'm at home, where I'm alienated. It's a little different than just comfort or discomfort. It's got there are more notes in the scale than that. And so this is the sort of way in which Schneider is really crippled. It doesn't have much of an effective life in that sense. And anyway, but let's. So in talking about some of what Schneider is lacking, Merleau-Ponty brings this kind of theme up at the bottom of 159, and he says, for Schneider, faces are neither pleasant nor unpleasant. I'm not so much interested in the people. We're going to come back to that. That's what I'm really interested in. So for the moment, I want to stress something else. But then for Schneider, the sun and the rain are neither joyful nor sad. His mood depends only upon elementary organic functions. I guess that means he doesn't like it when he feels like he has to pee, and then he's happy after he's peed, or doesn't like it when he's hungry, or he's happy when he has something to eat. In other words, he gets in a bad mood when there's an organic function that needs sort of relief or satisfaction, and he's in a good mood when that comes, right? But anyway, the world is affectively neutral, right? So what stands out about Schneider is the absence, or I should say, what Schneider makes stand out is that by the absence of that in him, he draws attention to the fact that that's not the case with us. So our inhabitation of the world is charged with a rich kind of affective meaning, and that is things like, you know, joy or sadness with the rain or the sun or whatever else. And it's, you know, when you go back and think about that lived space of your family home or your friends' home, places where you feel at home, you know, already there you can see that there are dimensions of meaning to it. Like, think about your family house, assuming that's where you feel at home. It's not just monolithic. You know, probably you go to the living room when you feel like doing something. So it's got a sense of the place where something interesting or exciting does happen, or could happen, or should happen. And probably go there sometimes you're disappointed, but you know, it's the living room is probably something like the place of, you know, activity in it, and it's like when you want to get something done or whatever, when you want to get going, like maybe that's where you go. Whereas maybe you turn to the kitchen when you've been working hard and you're frustrated or something, or tired, and you want to get a snack or something. It's not a matter of nutrition, though probably use the kitchen for that too, but it's not that. It's that's where you go for that retreat, well, almost like Schneider, that retreat into organic comfort. Like, I'm just going to get something to eat, just to have a nice taste in my mouth and chew, and be able to, in a way, do something meaningless. I can leave that complex world of working I was involved in and go back and just turn myself into an organism that just eats or something, you know, something like that. I don't know exactly what you do, but I think that thing I'm describing is pretty common. very similar probably to why people smoke cigarettes too. In the bedroom, like bedroom's got a few meanings, but one big one would probably be it's the place in a way of ultimate rest. Like it's really where you're going to go to sleep. So even if the home in general is where you get a kind of rest from the world, bedroom is where you go to really shut down. And so it's a place where you feel ideally the most secure because you can turn everything off, and you can go there and sleep and let the whole rest of the world fall away and not worry about it and sleep comfortably. People have trouble with sleep, obviously. I shouldn't say obviously, but people have trouble with sleep. Probably have a lot of difficulty with exactly that kind of experience. People who have suffered nasty things happening to them in the bedroom, precisely if the bedroom was supposed to mean that to them, can have real troubles around those issues of sleep and security, because what was supposed to be the most secure, comfortable resting place has been undermined, something like that. Anyway, so that's maybe some of the sense of the bedroom. And the bedroom, if you think of, if you bring sex into that, the bedroom might also be a place that is really, real more so than the living room, charged with excitement because you think that's where I'm going to do that thing I really want to do with you or whatever. Gaston Bachelard has this fun, very, very engaging, imaginatively and intellectually engaging book, The Poetics of Space. And there he talks about sort of like what is, from people around the world live in different kinds of houses for sure. But he's just sort of investigating like what are the different compartments of a house and how are they imaginatively meaningful. And he talks about what the experience of a cellar is like, or the attic. And of course those people have different experiences, but I think for a lot of children in the world I'm familiar with, the cellar in the house is a mysterious and exciting place to explore, kind of scary. Attic too. So all I'm getting at is, if you think about the lived experience of home and you associate that with a house, which it is for a lot of people, you can see that even in that sense of home, there's a palette of different colors, or a scale of different tones. Like yes, it's the place of familiarity, but there are many different charges, and your whole sort of emotional life is articulated, or I should say the house is articulated in terms of the whole range of your emotions. And then if you add your girlfriend or your boyfriend's house, or your favorite bar, or your workplace as part of those orienting points of reference on the map of your lived space, you can easily see that they're going to have a different kind of emotional charge than your own house, and so what I'm trying to get at is you can see already in that sense of lived space that the rich dimensions of affectivity, of emotion, that define the meanings, the lived meanings of the spatial parameters of your world. Now, and those have a lot to do with how through your engagement with the world as a kind of material reality, how you're going to feel, and how you're going to be able to do those things you desire, etc., etc., or be confronted with things you don't desire, and so on. So there's in all of that talk of emotion, there's a lot of dimensions of attraction and repulsion, pleasure and pain, and so on. That's a lot of what those are some of the essential dimensions of those emotional experiences. So anyway, I just wanted you to get to think about that, and now then to talk about sexuality. So sexuality is again then. Well, actually, let me say one more word first. So we'd already talked about lived space as being oriented, and that was basically the core orientation of familiar, unfamiliar, home, alien, that kind of thing. But as I'm bringing out the emotional articulation of that, we're bringing out a richer sense of orientation. This is how you're oriented to the house. The attic, if you're a child, let's say, or maybe even as a grown-up, the attic is exciting and secret and a little scary. The bedroom is a great place for comfort and retreat. The living room is where I always turn to when I just want to do my thing, or whatever, that kind of stuff, right? you can see that those are versions of orientation. Those are more fully pulling out the orientation. So I want to talk a little bit more now about that issue of orientation in our lived inhabitation, and that's the important thing that sexuality is about. It's about the way we're oriented towards something in particular, and that is other people. So there is a way, of course, that you can, if you're in a job interview or something, and especially if you're doing a job interview properly, you know, you're actually going to be trying to assess a person's capabilities, accomplishments, prospects for completing the job. It's a pretty intellectual task. You know, there's going to be an emotional level to it too. Like you're probably going to be concerned a little bit about whether you click with this person and really whether you think they're going to be a good colleague or whatever. Like that's all relevant. But the thing I want to get at is that interviews in that context are really about a kind of intellectual assessment of a kind of worldly resource for doing things. You know, use your thought. And that's a way you can think about people. And you know, you can also, if you're going to until they make a lot more driverless cars. You know, if you get a ride in a taxi or on a bus, a person is going to drive you, and so you can interact with someone as a person providing you a service, and you have that kind of instrumental, roughly instrumental relationship to them. You know, as Kant says, the moral imperative is to always treat people as ends and not merely as means. You will treat people as means, but you don't have to treat them merely as means. And so in those instrumental relations, it's not, ideally you're not just treating them instrumentally, you still greet the person and try to be polite and respect boundaries and so on. But your main relationship to them is how they're going to play a role in carrying out your project. Again, pretty intellectual and pretty reflective. Because we could say more, but now I want to talk about a different way that we relate to people, and that's the sexual way. And the thing there is that the sexual relationship, the sexual attraction or repulsion, I'm going to stick to attraction though. The sexual attraction to someone is a way that you are affected affectively, right? It's the way you feel something about that person that has to do with being drawn to them. But it's not a matter of representation. It's not a matter of self-conscious reflection. It's not a conceptual grasp. It's not like this person would be a good person for carrying out this task or whatever. It's a matter of you finding yourself drawn to them, finding yourself struck by that. And that's the first significant point that I think I really want to bring out here. Like the key, the core, I guess, of but maybe the key to thinking about sexuality is to think of it neither as an automatic reflex nor as a representation, which means to see it as something meaningful. That's why it's not an automatic reflex. And we'll go on perhaps to say a little bit about some of the dimensions of the meaningful side of it. Something meaningful, but not something deliberately chosen, and especially therefore not something that's able to be simply run by your self-conscious mind, your reflection. You find yourself drawn to certain other people. And let me actually read a little bit. There are two really good parts. The one really good part is like about 10 lines on 158, and one's about 10 lines on 159. I just want to think which one I want to read first. Yeah, let me read the 159 first, because that fits closer to what I was just saying. So here, he says, this is the paragraph that begins on 159. Here, we can detect a mode of perception that is distinct from objective perception. I mean, that's the same thing we've been talking about before, right? When you explicitly encounter something as an alien object that you're detached from and so on, that's sort of everyday sort of natural theoretical stance towards things that we've been challenging, that we've been showing not to be the primary nor neither the exclusive nor the primary dimension of our experience. And indeed, in many ways, we were already challenging that with Kant and Hegel. But anyway, but that's what we've been doing with Merleau-Ponty. So anyway, so we're going to detect the mode of perception that's distinct from objective perception, a genre of signification distinct from intellectual signification, right? So that's what I was just saying. You know, you can have intellectual relationships to these other people, but that's not what we're thinking about. And an intentionality, all right, a bodily way of being committed to a certain object or situation, a bodily way of being oriented towards the world, and an intentionality that is not the pure consciousness of something. It is consciousness of something in some sense of those terms. He's saying it's not at the level, though, of that explicit reflective cognizing. That's why it's in quotation marks. Erotic perception is not a cogitatio that intends a cogitatum. It's not an act of thinking that aims at an intelligible object. Rather, okay, here's where he really starts to say it. Through one body, it aims at another body. Okay, so remember, there's that line I quoted repeatedly, I think, in the Phantom Limb chapter. I'll try to find it quickly, where he said, this is the top of 81, the situation provides only a practical signification, and the recognition that it induces is merely a bodily recognition. Calls for the animal's movements. That's when he was talking about substitution in the insect with the leg and stuff. But anyway, I talked about that a lot, about the notion of a practical signification that calls for a bodily recognition. Well, that's a version of what he's talking about here, right? Erotic perception, through one body, it aims at another body. So aims is the version of intentionality. But so in erotic life, you know, you have a bodily intentionality, your body, and in all the rich meanings it has, not your body as that object on the surgeon's table that we talked about and that Sartre talks about, but your body in the sense of your possibility for involvement in situations, your body as the I can that we talked about before. Erotic perception is that body aiming at, orienting itself, taking as what it's about another body, and by another body he means the body of another person. Through one body, erotic perception aims at another body, and erotic perception is accomplished in the world, not within consciousness, right? So the thing you're trying to do isn't a thought that you solve by thinking. It's an orientation that is enacted and realized in a worldly practice. So he says, so for me, a scene doesn't have a sexual significance when I imagine, even confusedly, its possible relation to my sexual organs or to my states of pleasure. I mean, that's what the sort of embarrassingly stupid way that TV ads and everything else talk about sex, and probably lots of stuff in the pornographic industries like that too. You know, this idea that sex is really about a self-consciously chosen instrumental practice of trying to make use of something for the pleasure of genital stimulation or something. Of course, a person can do that. Like, you can seek things out for that reason. It's just that doesn't have much to do with sex. So that's representation. Like, that's not so different from Schneider. That's the intellectual design of a plan and the enactment of intentional instrumental relationships to achieve a self-defined, objectively defined goal. Now, you can do that the same way that you can get a ride in a taxi, or you can go to the store to try to buy the right shovel to dig a hole in your backyard. Of course you can do that. But that has never entered into that, under those terms, that has never entered into the domain of sexuality. It's probably true that there are lots of people who think that way, and are actually, it's really, they don't know what's going on in their sexuality, and so they really are having a certain kind of sexual life, and they just have a pretty flat way of dealing with it because they don't really know how to make sense of it, and they interpret it in those quite uninteresting ways that you get from your TV and the porn industry. And so that's the best they can do to enact their sexual life. So of course those people are still engaged in their sexuality, and probably therefore they're getting a lot more out of the experience than what they take themselves to be getting out of it. If you're interested, you could read an essay I wrote called "Why Sexuality Matters," where I try to talk a little bit about those kinds of issues in a way. So that's something you could pursue if you're interested. But in any case, so yeah, you could do that. But in that case, that description, the intellectualist sort of description, is not really what you're doing. It's a part of what you're doing, but something else is happening too. But you really do. But that description itself doesn't have much to do with sex. So let's continue what he says. For me, a scene doesn't have a sexual significance when I imagine, even confusedly, its possible relation to my sexual organs or to my states of pleasure. But rather, a sexual scene exists for me when, or a sexual scene has a scene has a sexual significance for me when it exists for my body. So so people say they're turned on. That's the relevant thing, first of all. It's not about a plan you make, it's you finding yourself turned on first. When it exists for my body, when it exists for this always ready power of tying together the given stimuli into an erotic situation and for adapting a sexual behavior to it. And then what is it like to know or to grasp sexually, right? It's not a cognitive operation, no. There is an erotic comprehension that is not of the order of the understanding, because understanding comprehends by seeing an experience under an idea or under a concept, whereas desire comprehends blindly by linking one body to another. So we're talking about desire, and that's different from intellectual planning. And that's really the big thing to remember, I guess, about the points I was making before. Desire is when you feel the urge to, in some significant way, couple bodily with that other body. But then, as he says, when it comes to sexuality, even though it's long been taken as a model of a bodily function on that kind of mind-body dualism, we're not faced with an automatic reflex, but rather with an intentionality that follows the general movement of existence and weakens along with it. In other words, your sexual life is going to reflect who you are in general. Like it's part of that. It's one side of that basic thing we've been talking about how you become a who inhabiting a particular world. It's a side of that core function of engagement with the world that is the root process behind that whole history of your experience that has produced that you as an ego subject and so on. That's the stuff we've been talking about for the last few weeks. So then he talks about Schneider and the things he's missing, because he's saying there, sexuality isn't a separate thing. Like it's not something attached to your what do you call it, reproductive organs or something like that. That's when he's talking about this automatic reflex stuff. He's saying, what happened is Schneider was crippled as a person, and all of the things that go into making a person got crippled, and so his sexuality is crippled in the same way that his spatiality is, because they're part of that same function. And so that same function, I mostly, when we talked about spatiality, I really only talked about the beginning section when he talks about live space and positional space, but he explores much more deeply in that chapter Schneider's problems in order to bring out an awful lot about space, but about vision and touch and all kinds of other things. And that chapter kind of concludes when he gets on page 137 to the notion of the intentional arc. I'm not going to go through in detail, but I'll just draw your attention to that. So basically what he says there is, there is a way in which a person kind of has a single thing they're doing that is kind of reflected in all the facets of their existence, but it's not a pre-given thing. It's more that through the ongoing enactment of your experience, all the different things that are happening kind of make you a single experiencing perspective, and that singleness also shapes how those things are carried out. That, like, there's kind of a mutual communication or mutual reinforcement between something like the unity of your experience and the multiplicity of your experience. And by multiplicity, I don't mean this experience. I mean something like you have motor skills, you have motor powers, you have sensory powers, you have sexual orientation, you have intellectual powers. Like these quite different, weird set of things human beings have. You have 4 or 5 major sectors of life: perceptual, motor, intellectual, emotional, and they work together. But they can, in fact, they can come to fall apart in certain ways. But one of the things he says here is like there's never something really that just strikes one. What gets struck is the unity of you as a person. And so it might primarily show itself in intellect, into your intellectual powers, but it's also going to be reflected sexually, perceptually, in movement, or et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so he calls that the way that those differentiated sectors of our powers kind of I'm going to say one more thing about that in a second. The way that they basically function as a unity, he calls that unity the intentional arc. Let me skip back and say the thing I was going to say to clarify it. Your body has hands and shoulders and head, right? And they kind of work together, but they remain differentiated. But because, as he was saying before, the different parts of your body effectively envelop each other. What's going on in your shoulder matters to your hand. If your hand is damaged, other things will take over that hand function. So something that damages your hand doesn't just affect your hand; it's also going to affect how you live your arm in relationship to your chest for holding things, or your shoulder for poking buttons because you don't have fingers anymore, or whatever, right? The very meaning of each of the parts of your body is that they are how you do something. And so you still has to be able to do its stuff if you're missing those parts. And so other things will, in a way, take over some of those functions. That was that phenomenon of substitution we were talking about. But so you can have something that damages your hand in the sense in which it didn't damage your shoulder, like it's your hand that got blown off by the grenade, not your shoulder. But at the same time, in damaging your hand, all these other things get affected too. You can have something that damages your hearing, but it's going to affect all of these things. And Merleau-Ponty is saying that. So the way I'm talking about body parts there, with respect to the unity of the body, he's saying that same thing with respect to these this fundamentally different sectors of our powers, like the ability to move, our motor abilities, our ability to sense, our ability to think, our affective life. Anyway, actually, let me read you one more sentence about that. 137, the bottom. He says, an intentional arc that projects around us our past, our future, our human milieu, our physical situation, our ideological situation, and our moral situation, or rather, that ensures that we are situated within all of these relationships. This intentional arc creates the unity of the senses, creates the unity of the senses with intelligence, and creates the unity of sensitivity and motricity. And that's what goes limp in Schneider's problem. And these things in a way can fall apart and so on. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that notion about the intentional arc because I was talking about Schneider and that remark where he says the thing that goes limp there. It's not an automatic reflex, but rather an intentionality that follows the general movement of existence and that weakens along with it. That was at the bottom of 159. He's referring back to that same intentional arc he was talking about with Schneider. And the point there was that your sexuality is your sexuality. Like it's about you and about in a significant way who you are as a person are in that thing. So you're in that way, the sexual dimension of your life is picking up on this kind of automatic reflex thing. Like it's not just a place that does something that is officially defined as the sexual function, right? If you were studying the animal world, you might very well talk about the sexual function, and people will talk about that in relationship to human beings too. But that's not what sexuality is. That's not our sexual being. Our sexual being is how whatever that dimension of the sexual function or whatever else is, becomes that through which we have a kind of meaningful grasp of the world, right? The way that that other body is going to appear to me and grip me isn't going to be just a story about physiology again, right? It's going to be about the meanings that are infused in that other body and in my body, and in the sense of what that coupling is, that the meanings that have become infused into that through that whole history of establishing and inhabiting a world, right? It's going to be, you're going to use your hand as the person who you are, engages graspingly with the world, and you're going to enact those sexual relationships in the way the kind of person you are has come through that range of capacities to inhabit a world. I realize those things I said at the end grew kind of a little bit more amorphous because I got off on that intentional arc direction, which he mentions again on 160. But let me just, I'm going to come back to that sense of the meaningfulness I'm talking about is that actually what I'm going to go on to talk about. So that'll be clear in a minute. Let me just go back still to 158. So what I had been talking about was the idea that sexuality is neither a reflex nor a representation, but it's that bodily intentionality, that notion of a bodily recognition of a practical significance that he talked about in Phenomenology chapter, and the idea here of the erotic perception that through one body aims at another, and et cetera, et cetera. So now let's talk a little bit more about that experientially. So here he introduces quite a nice notion. This is back on 158. So he says, this is how he begins, after he's just said, the study of Schneider reveals this living zone between automatic reflex and representation. He says, there must be an eros or libido that animates an original world. I think the sense of that original world, I think the point he's making there is that the sexual significance of things is not reducible to anything else, right? That that is a meaning in its own right. Even though, now let me give you the even though. The even though, I think, is what I was trying to get at before when I was talking about the intentional arc. Even though sexuality is not autonomous in the sense that it is a thing you do wholly separate from everything else, right? So the point I was trying to get at the talk of the intentional arc is that your sexuality is integrated with motion, perception. Oh, there's my son. Hold on. Sorry, that was just my young son waking up from his nap a little earlier than expected. Yeah, so I was just finishing up this talk really about the intentional arc because I was picking up on this stuff about the automatic reflex. I was saying that sexuality is not, on the one hand, it's not just, as Merleau-Ponty says in here, they're an autonomous zone, by which he means there isn't such a thing as just a sexual meaning, and then there are all those other meanings, and it just has its own single thing that it does. So it is integrated in its meaning with our perceptual life, our intellectual life, our everything else, right? Our motion, our motor life, our spatial life. It's integrated with those things, and the intentional arc is the idea that there is a single identity realized through all those things, analogously to the way that there is a single animal life and a single animal experience realized through all the limbs and joints and organs of a body. On the one hand. On the other hand, sexuality nonetheless is not reducible to anything else. And that's what he means when he says it animates an original world. And so that's in a way then what we really want to talk about is what is the meaning of the sexual sphere? Now at a certain level, we're not going to be able to answer that. Like at a certain level you can't say what space is, you just got to experience it. At a certain level you can't say what time is, you just got to experience it. Similarly, at a certain level you can't say what sexuality is, you just have to experience it. But we're talking around that when we talk about the way through one body it aims at another body and aims towards a certain kind of bodily coupling. Let's carry on with what what he was saying back on 158. There must be an eros or libido. Eros is just a Greek word for this, from which we get the word erotic. So this animating erotic force, an eros or a libido. I don't know the origin of that word. It roughly means life energy, but Freud uses it, and so he's conjuring up here Plato and Freud, an eros or a libido. Freud uses it to mean sexual energy, right? So there must be an eros or a libido that animates an original world, gives external stimuli a sexual value or signification, and sketches out for each subject the use to which he will put his objective body. Actually, just as an aside, yeah, he's conjuring up Plato and Freud in a certain way. His chapter is going to vindicate the interpretations of sexuality that you find in Freud and in Plato, and sort of show them to be of a piece. Not just simply taking them over altogether, but to say, like, yeah, what those guys are doing, like, yeah, that's what phenomenological investigation of sexuality reveals. But anyway, there must be an eros or libido that animates an original world, gives external stimuli a sexual value or signification. Right. In other words, there's got to be this impulse that makes it be possible for things to appear to you in that relevant sexual way, and sketches out for each subject the use to which he will put his objective body. So he's saying this thing that makes salient certain ways of perceiving things outside you, and makes salient certain things about your own body. And then he's going to elaborate that in the next couple of sentences. And I think these sentences are quite rich and could be used. You could build a lot out of them. I don't know how much people do build out of them. I know a few people have written about it, but I think you could build a lot out of this. Anyway, he says, for Schneider, it's the very structure of erotic perception or experience that is altered, largely lost. But for the normal person, a body, another person's body, is not perceived merely as just another object. Rather, though we have that objective perception, you know it's that, this objective perception is inhabited by a more secret one. And I think that notion of secret is a little bit important to capturing something about what the meaning of sexuality is. Now, I mean, I think sexuality is going to have a lot to do with something like intimacy. And so secret makes sense in the sense that it's about something not exactly shareable, well, shareable maybe with another person, but like not public, not shareable universally. And maybe that's related to his point back on 156 that he's going to talk about experience of a world that has sense and reality only for us. But anyway, so I think that word secret is relevant, and it's going to come up a little bit later when somewhere around near the end of the chapter, around page 171 or 172 or something, like another rich section, he talks about a kind of a seedy atmosphere. I think he's trying to capture something about a tone that sexuality has. I think that word secret is phenomenologically relevant. But anyway, this objective perception is inhabited by a more secret one, the visible body is underpinned by a strictly individual sexual schema that accentuates erogenous zones, sketches out a sexual physiognomy, and calls forth the gestures of the masculine body. I mean, he's been talking about Schneider and so on. There doesn't have to be masculine body in this case. It is a more generic statement, which is itself integrated into the effective totality. I mean, I think in other words, I think he's talking about the sexual perspective a man would have, a masculine person would have, but that's not integral to the overall account he's trying to give of sexuality. That's just the way he's talking at this spot. But anyway, the relevant point I want to get to is this notion of a sexual schema. An individual sexual schema that accentuates erogenous zones and sketches out a sexual physiognomy. Schema sexual. I want to talk about what that means. To do that, I want to first jump back to, again, the chapter on space. And the opening section, pages, it's on 100, pages 100 to 102, he first talks about the notion of a body, a bodily schema. So I didn't talk about that when we talked about space, but I talked about the idea, and I'll just go over it quickly. We initially talked about the notion of situational space by talking about how it is that your body knows where the rest of the body is, right? Your hand knows where your shoulder is, and so on. That's the body schema. The body schema is the way you live from a sense of your body as a power for engagement. So it distinguishes it from a more familiar notion that we sometimes use of a body image. So we sometimes talk about people having a body image, and by that we usually mean something like a kind of reflective representation, right? Like an explicit idea they have of themselves, and especially of something like what the visible contours of my body look like. So he wants to take that and differentiate the body schema from that. We don't mean that. We mean how you experience your own body, what your body seems like to you, but not at the level of a reflective representation of your body as an object, but at a non-reflective grasp of your body as a subject, as the living power for engagement. So the body schema is your lived sense of what your body is, and your lived sense of your body as a power for engagement with things. Let me see quickly if there's a quote worth reading. Yeah, it's not necessary, but you can go back there and read it. But the point of the body schema is you always operate on the basis of a lived sense, essentially of the unity of your body, and of the unity of your body as a power. And so there's a maybe I can say this to clarify. There's a kind of a self-consciousness built into your body, which is evident in the fact that your hand knows where your shoulder is when a mosquito is stinging it. It's also evident, when you can hold an egg without crunching it, like you know how much pressure to put on, but you don't particularly think about it. It's like you have a living sense in your hand of this power and how to gauge it and control it. There's a kind of an I in your body, and the capital letter I, not EYE. There's an ego. There's an I in your body that is the unified functioning of all those things. But that it's the I can, right? That bodily I is not reflective. It's not a representation, and it's not about the body as an object, right? It's the lived unity of yourself as an acting subject, spatially distributed as this manifold body, right, with differentiated things like the grasping part and the chewing part and the walking part, that while differentiated are nonetheless different sort of nodes or facets of a single acting function. That's I tried to pull in a few of the themes I've just been talking about, like with the attentional arc and so on, but that's the body schema, right? Well, so the thing is, Curie talks about a sexual schema. Now, initially he's talking about a sexual schema as pertaining to the body of the other person, but it pertains to you as well. So he says what happens is your perception of the other's body is the perception of that body as sexually relevant. So the body is perceived for you in terms of your non-reflective motivation towards a kind of bodily coupling with bodies of others that attract you. And in light of that, the way that body appears is perceptually, different things are perceptually highlighted, right? It has its own sexual schema, which is, and it says it sort of sketches out a sexual physiognomy, may accentuate erogenous zones, but it's not like, oh, you always look at a person's shoulders or chest or eyes, or it's not a matter of you having a set of independently defined body parts that you identify, which again is the misleading mistake of pornography and whatever else. Rather, as he says, a strictly individual sexual schema, another body expresses itself as a sexually attractive being through all the differentiations and determinations of its body. But exactly how those lines and contours and pieces and shapes are going to be thus expressive is that's the style of the person. Like, that comes from the individual. It's not this, you can't just say, oh, it's got this part and this part. And in a way, what is expressed when he says it sketches out a sexual physiognomy, well, to the extent that the erotic perception, in erotic perception, one body aims at another body and comprehends in the world through a kind of coupling, it is in a way how that body expresses or communicates possibility for engaging with it as a body, right? And he says, that accentuates the erogenous zones. Like, no doubt, it is the case that by and large, though surely not exclusively, no doubt it is the case that by and large, the things that we think of as the sexual characteristics of the body play a prominent role in that. But it's not a matter of an inventory of 6 parts. It's a matter of the unique sexual expressiveness of another body. And what it does is he calls forth the gestures of the masculine body. I mean, because he's imagining a man in that situation and a masculine man. But rather, it's what calls forth from you the appropriate bodily responsiveness, calls forth from you as a body an appropriate response. So anyway, I think that description is quite interesting. And I wanted to connect it with the theme of the body schema, because even though he's talking about the other person's body, it seems to me, and in the other case he's talking about your own body, that other person's body in its schema is speaking to your body as something from which a response is elicited. And so there is, in other words, a pairing of your perception of the other's body and your sense of your own body as a kind of sexual agency. Probably a lot of people really get inhibited in their sexual life by the imposition of their body image in place of a body schema, right? So the more straightforward thing would be, and probably a lot of people have this sort of natural, sort of more naive reaction, and it's presumably what comes out in truly sexual or erotic situations. You live out of your body as a sexual thing, but without really particularly construing it as an object. But a lot of people probably get hung up with their own explicit representations and can't let themselves be a bodily subject, but have to manipulate their own behaviors, right? And get wrapped up with things about what they think they look like, et cetera, right? So you can see how that notion of a body image, or the notion of cognitive reflection, actually is probably deeply antithetical to sexuality as such, which is about coming to inhabit a body, the parameters of which are revealed to you in the dynamic of attraction and interaction. I lost the thread of my sentence there, but what happens is that what should be happening that way can be interrupted by trying to make it answer to the demands of reflection. I want to say one more thing about this, about the bodily comprehension. I mean, I think if you want to read more about this, I think one of the best places to read is Being in Nothingness, Sartre's discussion of sexual desire in the section of the book, chapter of the book called Concrete Relations with Others. And this is part of what he calls the second attitude towards others. And Sartre, I mean, so many things in Merleau-Ponty are largely taken over from Sartre. And Sartre is, like Merleau-Ponty, it's these French existential phenomenologists. They're the people, and de Beauvoir, and so they're the people who really did this phenomenology of the body. It's most famously and probably prominently associated with Merleau-Ponty, but it's really rich in those other two as well. But in Being in Nothingness in particular, you get a rich study of the body as object versus the lived body, and you get this really really insightful discussion of sexuality. And this is the point I want to get to. The thing that Sartre identifies as the decisive and definitive thing of sexuality is what he calls the caress. And he's trying to say, what is the meaning of sexuality? He says, the real meaning of sexuality, it is this um, erotic comprehension that's not of the order of understanding, where desire comprehends blindly by linking one body to another. But Sartre, I think, better than Merleau-Ponty, goes into that and talks about what's happening there. And he talks about sexuality as, in a way, becoming bodily. And he says that caress is the definitive sexual act. And I think that point is brilliant and a great antidote to the crap you usually hear. And he says the thing about the caress is it's essentially how you let the other person be flesh, is what he says. I'm not going to go on and explore it. You could go read it. It's great. But the reason I think it's particularly important is because the reason I'm bringing it up is because Sartre, it seems to me, does an excellent phenomenological job of describing what the distinctive character of sexual experience is, what the distinctive character of a sexual act is, as opposed to all the other kinds of things you do. Really trying to distinguish it from automatic reflex and representation, but not just doing it negatively, trying to say, okay, what is it? And so I was saying before, like so many things in experience, if you don't actually have a living engagement with it, you don't really know what's being talked about. You can say lots of things to define it, but you, in a way, have to know what it is from being inside it. And that makes it hard about anything, time, space, whatever else, ever to explain it perfectly. It's really a matter of taking experiences that people have and working to illuminate those things. But Sartre, I think, does a particularly good job of illuminating what it is that makes an experience sexual. So I would recommend that as a strong, the discussion of the caress as a strong piece, complementary piece or supplementary piece to put into these pages here to capture that. But anyway, yeah, so I was bringing it back to the body schema because the point I was trying to get at is that here's why we bring it back to that, and then here's why we'll add something to it. We're trying to bring it back to this idea that something about the unique appearing of the other person conjures up in you on a certain sort of appropriate response. And so you're living out of a kind of sexual body schema in the sense that you experience yourself as a kind of sexual agent, where your body is charged with the relevant meanings for engagement in a sexual situation. That's how I'm linking it back. So he doesn't use the word sexual schema to talk about yourself, as far as I know. He just says it calls forth the gestures of the masculine body. But the interesting thing is he does use that language to talk about the other person, and I wonder if that also allows us to add something. Later on in the book, I think in a section we're probably not going to read, though I might quote it at some point. I think it's in the chapter on other selves, chapter 4, part 2, the human world, where he talks about a kind of sharedness of body schema, that we live in sort of cooperative relationships such that we, at a lived level, our sense of our own body can incorporate in a way the others and so on. Maybe I imagine actually I will talk about that a little bit later on. I'll just mention it here. But I'll mention it here so that I can say something else. I want to note that idea that there's a sense of the other person's body that is integrated with the sense of your own body, and this is not particularly reflective, though you can reflect on it. But it's interesting then to think of that sense of the body schema, the sense of the I can, the sense of your inhabitation of a body as in some way intrinsically connecting with the experience of someone else's body. Anyway, that's just a passing thought. Anyway, I think that section is quite good. Yeah, I think that's enough for talking about this section from 158 to 160, but I think it's a really good section for trying to bring out what you need to do to talk about sexuality. And the point is, we are those kinds of beings, and it is integral to our experience to be sexual, and therefore, just as your hand is integrated into your body, your sexual life is integrated into the rest of your life in the context of that intentional arc. And so it's at least the case that in our sexual life, we will find reflected the things that are going on in other parts of our lives. So in that sense, the kinds of investigations you get in Freud, psychoanalytic reflections, are exactly what you would expect to be right? Analyzing looking to sexuality as the domain of the sort of unconscious things that are at play in your psychological life and so on. I mentioned that before, and when we talked about live time and live space, I was saying why this makes something like psychoanalysis what you would expect to be right. Well, now that we've added the sexual meaning to all of our experience, that's a further way of saying, well, yeah, actually the thing they're doing in psychoanalysis is something you would expect. And not surprisingly, then Sartre goes on immediately to start talking about Freud and psychoanalysis. That's the next section. But as we've talked about it now, sexuality would just be one more sector among many. Yes, your life is going to be reflected in sexuality, but that doesn't mean sexuality would be privileged as a thing that you should turn to try to understand things. So now we want to talk a little bit more about what goes on in sexuality to see why actually it does have a certain kind of privilege without losing its distinctive character of sexuality. Indeed, because of something about its distinctive character of sexuality, it has a particularly pivotal place in our psyche, and this is where we get into the issue of other people. So I'm not going to talk about this section on Freud that's right there and psychoanalysis. I'm not going to talk about that next little section about why existentialism is not a spiritualism. But on 163, Merleau-Ponty begins the section, the title of which is In What Sense Does Sexuality Express Existence? And he says, by accomplishing it. That section is great. And I don't, because of what I want to talk about, which comes immediately after that, I think I'm not going to go into that section. But really, he's saying there, here you can see how something like an existential psychoanalysis would talk about people's hangups and people's behavior and so on. Anyway, there's a ton of stuff in that section that's really, really great. But I want to skip to the section that starts on 169. The subtitle is The Sexual Drama Does Not Reduce to a Metaphysical Drama, Rather Sexuality is Metaphysical. I want to talk about that stuff. Basically, I want to talk about that to get us to the theme of other people. And I don't think I'll pursue it too much after that, but I'll move on to language, and I may have a reason to come back and say a couple other things. So the point is, we're now talking about that experience of you being non-reflectively attracted to another being. And as an aside, that's a reason why gender is not a matter of choice, right? Gender, both in the sense of yourself and in your sense of your chosen sexual object. We're talking about lived experience. We're talking about the way you, as a reflective evil, find yourself compelled by the world. And so going back to that thing about the sexual schema, like there's a way that you find other bodies attractive, and it's not something that's optional. You can't choose and say, oh, I'm gonna have that. Like, you find yourself attracted by bodies that communicate their sexuality to you in a certain way, and you find yourself drawn to respond to them. So Merleau-Ponty, as I said, was talking about a man and talking about the gestures of a masculine body, but the analysis he's actually giving really would say, like, you may very well live out of a body schema in a sexual context that feels this way to you or this way. Like, maybe that the way you interpret that is like, I experience as a woman, or I experience as a man, or I experience as something else entirely, right? But the relevant point is, these are things that are not matters of reflective choice, right? These are matters of how you find yourself already coupled with the world in these effectively gripping ways that pull out of you behaviors about kind of bodily coupling and so on. So anyway, that's some of the resources there for a phenomenology of gender, basically. But so what I want to get to is, as I said, this later part. So you're engaging with another person sexually. Let me say that sentence different. You're engaging with another person sexually, but you're also engaging with another person sexually. That's the point of this last part. So I guess the first part of my talk was about you're engaging with another person sexually, and now the second part of my talk in this chapter is you're engaging with another person sexually. Um, uh, the he says on page 170, to say that I have a body. He's talking about this in the context of sexuality. What is this sexual meaning here? He says, to say that I have a body is thus a way of saying that I can be seen as an object and that I seek to be seen as a subject. And then a little bit later down, he says, in the context of sexual life, we do not attempt then to possess a body, but rather a body animated by a consciousness. So those two passages on 170 both speak about a certain thing, right? So he's saying the thing is in sexuality, where you're attracted to another person, the thing about another person is that they're a subject too. They're a subject for the world, and so they're someone who also sees you and might or might not be attracted or whatever else. And so you are encountering someone who is a subject, and it is a person that you're going to couple with, and you also are a person, and that other is going to couple with you. In coupling with you, they're going to be coupling with a person. And so the thing he talks about here on 169 to 171 is basically that idea that our reality as free subjects is alive in sexuality. And so it's in sexuality that we actually are really coming into contact with other people. So in that sexual encounter, a free being is coupling with another free being. A free bodily subject is coupling with a free bodily subject. So whether you like it or not, sexuality is the domain of freedom encountering freedom. And, to cut a long story short, and if you want to make that short story long again, go back and listen to the lectures on Hegel. The first and the second ones about the independence of self-consciousness. The encounter of freedom with freedom has norms built into it and issues built into it. And so in sexuality, what happens is this bodily comprehension of another body as attractive that calls forth from me certain processes of bodily coupling, calls from us bodily coupling, is in fact an encounter of freedom with the freedom. And therefore there's always going to be a question of how well this practice is living up to and realizing the reality of what's happening there. And so the domain of sexuality, people talk about it in the sort of bad ways I was criticizing before. People talk about it as if it were the domain of instrumentally pursuing genital pleasures or something like that. That's quite far from the issues that are actually alive in sexuality. Sexuality is actually a domain where what comes into play are all those complex issues of recognition that Hegel talked about. And Merleau-Ponty makes that very explicit. He says, these things would never happen if sexual, this is at the bottom of 170, about 5 lines up. These things would never happen if sexual experience were not like a passive experience given to everyone and always available of the human condition in its most general moments of autonomy and dependence. And in saying autonomy and dependence, he's explicitly alluding to Hegel's section on independence and dependence. And he has been referring to it in various ways around here. He's been talking about these relations of master and slave that Hegel talks about. So the point is, what comes to be alive in your sexual life is that issue of how you are involved in a cooperative activity with another person and sharing a human space in your bodily coupling, in whatever form that's taking. And so 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 uh, why then is sexuality such a privileged spot for understanding ourselves and for understanding the meaning of a world? Well, because in sexuality, though it has this distinct character of being this uh, bodily coupling with a body and so on. In sexuality, what is actually being encountered is one freedom by another. And so, at its core, sexuality is um, a domain, uh, one of the most basic domains we have for encountering other people. It's one of the core experiences of intersubjectivity. And so that's why sexuality, even though you say it has this meaning at the beginning, like this is the way it acts, what's contained in that is the domain of intersubjective life. What's contained in that is the domain of um, persons experiencing other persons with all of the issues that are involved in that. And so consequently, in our habitual embedded identity and our being in a sexual world, being in the world with the word sexual added, right? In that habitual world that has now become the basis of our life, that is a sexual world, the core meanings are the meanings of our defining orientation towards other people and so on, right? And so that's why, um, and this is the thing that Freud, ends up exploring so powerfully. How in our sexual life, in our desires and our hang-ups and all those kinds of things, what you actually end up seeing are the interpersonal struggles a child went through with his or her mom and dad, and then the playing out of that in the difficulties that grown-up child now has in dealing with the larger human world, right? So in our sexual life, we were talking about sexual life as sort of bringing in the terms of how the world is meaningful for us, that we live on, right? Think back to the talk of the habitual body in the phantom limb context. Well, that habit body with respect to sexuality is where we built into our world our basic relationship to the human condition in its most general moments of autonomy and dependence. And that's why sexuality, and hence why sexuality is so important, and hence why psychoanalysis is, in fact, so particularly important and insightful in an approach to understanding humans. And so, so the last thing I want to say then is about this before we move on to the section on language is the transition to that. So what we see in sexuality then is that at a core level, it is the domain in which persons communicate with other persons. So sexuality is a kind of communication between persons, and a communication enacted in bodily means. It's the way people communicate to each other in these intimate interpersonal ways who they take each other to be, and they do that through this kind of bodily coupling. And in that sense then, sexuality is a kind of original and core phenomenon of language. And so let's go on now and talk about the language chapter.
Okay, so I want to move on now to part 1, chapter 6, the body as expression and speech, which is basically about language. Once again, this chapter is immense, not so much in the number of pages, but just in the wealth of material. And so I'm not going to talk about a lot of it. I'm going to talk about stuff that roughly runs between about few pages, like 189 to 195 or something like that. I'm not even sure exactly what. But I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about some stuff from the chapter on others and the human world, mostly pages about 362 to 370, something like that, to bring out what I think is important about this, which, as I said, is ultimately going to be part of our phenomenology of the experience of others. Anyway, okay, so language. So let's just start by thinking about our everyday experience of language. So the most obvious thing, and presumably it's evident in what's happened in the last 15 minutes of this video, or in the last conversation you had with someone, or something like that. Excuse me, my eye's itchy here. What's immediately evident about it is that unless, in the context of listening to these lectures, unless English is not your native language or something like that, if you're fluent in English, you listen to me talk and you know what I'm talking about. That's the amazing fact. You go to the store, and you say to the person behind the counter, "Oh, do you have almond milk?" And the person says, "Yeah, it's over there in the freezer in the corner." And you say, "Okay, I'll go get some. I'll be back in a second." You say those things, and you understand each other. What is it that I'm saying there that I want you to notice? I want you to notice. Well, basically, we could call it communication, which is the word or the notion I ended our discussion of sexuality with. I want you to think about the notion of communication. What happens is, what you wanted was clear to the other person, and what that person wanted you to know about the thing you were asking about was made clear to you by that other person. You are able to share meanings. It's remarkable. The other person is able to know what you're thinking, and you can know what the other person is thinking. I remember when I was a kid, they used to have I don't know whether it was cartoons or science fiction stories or whatever, but there were always stories about mind readers, and it seems so amazing somebody could read what's on your mind. Well, you read what's on people's minds all the time. They tell you, and you tell other people, and amazingly, we basically just share our consciousness. Now that's pretty weird, because the very meaning of being a subject, this is something I brought out, I think maybe a little bit even in Kant, but especially in Hegel. The very meaning of being a subject is that you're absent from experience, right? That all of the presentations in someone's experience are there, and you're not one of them. You are experienced as the defining source of what is being put on display to you, but precisely as something that cannot be put on display as such. And so the very meaning of being a subject is that you can't be experienced as such, and consequently, philosophically, we have often tried to think about other people as alien, impenetrable enigmas, and that's the so-called problem of other minds. How can we ever know that there's another mind there? So there's something to say about that, and possibly I will end up talking about that issue directly, because it's a theme that Merleau-Ponty talks about in the chapter on other selves. But I think maybe not, but possibly. But I say that just to remind you of our common starting notion that others are unknown and impenetrable to us. If that's the case, our experience of language is bizarre, because we just share our experience with each other. Anyway, that's the first thing I want you to notice about language, is you just tell people what's on your mind, and then they know what's on your mind. And then they tell you what's on their mind, and you know what's on their mind. And so that means both that we can share with each other what's on our mind, and also that the experiences we are having ourselves, our own experiences, are inherently shareable. Right? They're not about inherently private mental contents. Right? The things precisely that we share are things that anybody could understand. I'm just thinking about this now, so I'm going to mention it. It would be a natural thing here to talk about, in the context of what I'm going to talk about today, or in this stuff. It would be natural to talk about Derrida's essay, Signature Event Context. It's possible I will. But if I don't, I just mention that as an obvious thing that should be brought into this conversation, relevant to that point I just made. But anyway, that's just a little footnote. So the thing about language then is that, so in our language use, we communicate. We share with each other our experiences. That's point number one. Point number two, that's done through making sounds, or scribbling on a piece of paper. Let's use talking in person as our example. That's done through going right, just making vocal sounds. And indeed, that stupid sound I just made, that's what it sounds like when people speak languages you don't understand. You don't know what they're saying. It just sounds like sounds. And so the thing is, when you're speaking a language, that's what it is too. But there's two stages here. First of all, that's not what you hear. When someone is speaking, you don't hear. When someone is speaking your language, you don't hear sounds. Whereas that is what you hear when someone is speaking a language you don't understand. Although with a small little qualification that I may remember to come back to when we talk about Merleau-Ponty and gesture, you typically do know, or at least suspect, they're speaking language. But nonetheless, it just is sounds. So when you, with a language with which you're unfamiliar, you hear sounds. The language with which you're familiar, you hear language. You hear words. Again, another little side note. That should remind you of that distinction between being at home versus the alien world when we talked about space. But now here we're talking about this with respect to sound and language and so on. Anyway, so I said there were some interesting things to notice. Well, first, you don't hear sounds, you hear words. But second, and this isn't the second interesting thing, this is the second part of the first interesting thing. Second, you don't hear words. Because when that person tells you, yeah, it's back in the corner, what you get is meanings. So the interesting thing is, through the experience of someone going, you hear through the sound to a word, but you hear through the word to the grasp of a meaning. That point will be clearer if I ask you to think back to, can you think of the last 17 words I said? And I would stake a lot of money on the belief that you can't. So what that shows you is, though you understood well enough what I said, and you still got it, you look back and you can't hear the words because you didn't hear them. I mean, in some kind of experiential way, the words were functional to you, but you heard a meaning. Through the hearing of words, you were directly presented with a meaning. Such that even right after having heard someone speak, you still have the meaning perfectly, often you could not reproduce the words that were said. Sometimes you can, but often you can't. And so when I say 17 words, like, it's unlikely that you could count back 17 words. So the first thing I said is we communicate, and I was talking about sharing our experience and how weird that is. The second thing I'm saying is we do that through language, and now I made two interesting points about that. One, sounds are at one level you could say sounds are what is present, but that's not true. What is present are not sounds. What is present are words. But words aren't even what is present, because what is present is meanings. Right? So that should be pretty striking. So again, we're doing phenomenology. So I'm trying to describe the way things are actually experienced. So those points I was just making were phenomenological points about our everyday experience of language. And then now I had one other point I wanted to make, and I just temporarily have lost it. Let me get it back. Oh well, can't get it. There was another interesting point there, and maybe I'll remember it later. But so the remarkable thing here then is that you, through the words, get a meaning, get direct access to a meaning, which is then both a bizarre experience of another mind and an amazing participation in a world that we would either call shared or public. Shared in as much as you're getting an experience that is available to you and the other person. So someone was giving you their experience, you were giving them your experience of a question, and the other person could share it. But another way we could say that is that you're put into a world, the meanings of which are publicly available, and that's what's expressed through those things. it's possible that this was the other point I was going to make, but I don't think so. But this is the next point I want to make. So the second, a second now, or I think it's a second point to notice about language. Like the first one was just to look at the situation of communication. Now look at another thing about communication, and that is when that person speaks to you in the language that you're fluent in, using only words that you know and all the rest, you are able to learn something. That person speaking to you is able to communicate something to you in your experience that matters to you, that on the basis of your personal experience alone you couldn't have. Like on the one hand, that's because it's the other person's experience, but also like you didn't know something and the person says, oh, the almond milk is back in the corner. Right? So the thing is that through language, you are given basically knowledge you didn't create on your own. You're given knowledge that somebody else worked at. In the case of the exchange in the convenience store, that's it's still interesting, but not such a big deal. But just step out for a second and think about going to school, right? The learning you get from reading books, history books, philosophy books, whatever your teacher is telling you, right? Through language, your whole grasp of the world is radically changed, right? And basically, what's being communicated through that language is the condensed version of the whole history of human experiencing, right? When you're studying chemistry, you're learning the collected, digested, polished, and powerfully delivered condensed insights of hundreds of years of chemists engaging in work with their bodies and with their intelligence, with this or that apparatus on this or that material thing. And that's now handed to you because you can speak language. So on the one hand, the use of language is easy and it allows you to share these experiences with other people. And in that language use, maybe this is the second point, maybe we'll say this. In that language use, you get a direct experience of the thing. You don't notice the language. And then those intervening points about sound, word, meaning. Then, also through language, you learn. Right, your fluency in language allows you to build up your experience by sharing the experience of other people. Amazing. So you can learn. You benefit from all the learning they did that you didn't do, and they just hand you the results, and you get it. Right? So those right there, I'm trying to draw your attention to as some of the most familiar dimensions, phenomenological descriptions of some of the most familiar dimensions of our everyday use of language, and they're all really remarkable. They should shock you in every case. Now, two other familiar issues about language use. When sometimes you're trying to remember someone's name, or you're trying to remember something you thought about, or there's something you're trying to grasp. It's very interesting that you can have this struggle with something you can't quite pull together. Like sometimes you're trying to express yourself to someone. You say it's like when and you when you're at, as we say, a loss for words. It's interesting that being at a loss for words is basically the same experience as not being able to grasp the thing you're trying to grasp. So in the earlier experience of the everyday comfortable communication, it seems like words just work perfectly and seamlessly, and their importance in a way kind of disappears from the experience because you think, oh yeah, we're just talking about the world. He's telling me where the almond milk is and so on. Those experiences of the ease of use can lead you to think that they're just fixed worldly things, and we've invented some words to match up to the structures of the world, and those words are now just playing pieces we move around to let people know about the structures of the world. So it would seem like either words are a convenient but unnecessary clothing or a fixture of things, or a convenient but not internally necessary clothing for thought, right? As if you have your thoughts and you invented some words to communicate them. We have some things and we invented some words to name them. But you really get the sense that things have their identity in their own right, and your thoughts have an identity in their own right. You use language to deal with those things, but precisely because it's so easy and comfortable, we tend to think that our thoughts and those things are independent of language, and it's just a convenience. But this experience of what happens when you're at a loss for words can start to draw your attention to the way that clear separation is not so clear. It's very interesting that until you can get the word, you don't have the thing. There might be more than one explanation for that, so I'm not going to pursue that further, but I put that to you just as a thing to think about. And then the last one, I want you now, building on that idea, but moving from a negative version of it, where you're at a loss for words and don't have the thing, to a positive version of it, I want you to think about some ways in which the words give you the thing. And here, there's an example Merleau-Ponty uses. I think it's in a footnote, which is what I'm drawing on. So you should look at the footnotes. As I told you, they're absolutely essential to this book. It's a good chance you haven't been reading them, but you really should with every chapter, because they contain a lot of important material. But anyway, one of the footnotes, he refers to the first words spoken in love. And I'd like you to think about that if you've ever been in a romantic relationship. Think back to our last chapter about sexuality and so on. If you've ever been in a situation with a human being where you're oriented towards coupling, right? One of the things about human beings is you can't just couple with them by grabbing them. I mean, you can, but you go to jail for it, and they don't like it. If you do want to carry out that bodily comprehension of the other body in the way that he was talking about in the chapter on sexuality, the bringing of that into being isn't simply a matter of the forceful taking of an object from out of the world. As I said, people try that, but that's rape. That's not sex. In normal human relations, and the ones we'd want to encourage, the ability to carry out that sexual encounter is a matter of communication, or said even more strongly, and this is in a way what I already said, that act is an act of communication, right? The sexual coupling has to be the way that, beyond an initial experience of some kind of attraction, this person as a body is in fact communicating her or his or their desire to couple with you as a body, at first and ongoingly, such that the thing that you're doing is a shared bodily engagement. So it's not just in fact the case that your hands fit together in a certain way. It's rather that your intentions fit together, right? In the experience of the sexual coupling isn't just about the skin of one organism touching against the skin of another organism. It's about a free being doing something with another free being. So that bodily act is both a material coupling and a piece of language. A material coupling and a sharing of intention between two people. Not intentions that are held back in the mind as private representations, though that could be true too, but rather intentions as the living orientation of a body that is itself only realized in and as that shared experience of coupling. So I wanted you to think about that way. So I wanted you to think about those kinds of relationships and the way that communication is involved there. If you are wanting to establish some relationship with another person, then and you've done the thing I've just been describing, then it should be the case that you have had an ongoing experience of, I mean, maybe you've done it so many times you're just used to it now, but it should be that you've had an ongoing experience of a little bit of wonder at the ongoing revelation of the other's shared interest. At each point, that sexual encounter only exists if and to the extent that it's what both people are intending, projecting, choosing. It's got to continue to be a shared orientation. And so it's not like you plug a thing in and a current just runs and it's going, right? It's not like you got it started and it's going to go on forever. No, like it's an unfolding process that is repeatedly and ongoingly a reiteration or a new iteration or a new enactment of a kind of sharedness. That doesn't have to mean that doesn't mean it has to be an ongoing experience of doubt where you wonder if it's going to be shared. And commonly, that's not the case, because commonly, precisely, people live in the security of the confirmation by that other person, and they feel confident because the other person is expressing that they should feel confident, and you feel a sense that we're doing this together. But sometimes you have little things, you break down and think, oh, I don't think that was what was supposed to happen, or I don't think the person liked that, or whatever. You can be reminded. Anyway, so the point I'm making is, in that sexual coupling, there should be to some extent, like, especially, I guess I'm mostly thinking of, when you first enter into this domain with another person, there should be a bit of ongoing novelty. I don't mean novelty in the sense of entertainment. I mean novelty in the sense that it keeps being new. And the simple fact that you started something doesn't guarantee that it's going to keep going. And so, and as your interaction becomes deeper or more substantial, you have new shared expressions of intent to continue and to go there. I guess what the thing I'm really trying to get you to notice there is an experience where, like, if you put it this way, you could say, if people are consenting to certain acts, let's put it that way. That's not a good way to describe it, but for the sake of my point, let's say that they're consenting to certain acts. Well, here you would be seeing where the act and the expression of consent can't be separated. It is in mutually adopting that activity that people mutually express their desire to do so. And their mutual expression of desire is the shared enacting of that. So I'm trying to get you to see this unity of the expression and what's expressed. I was using sex. It just occurred to me at the moment when I was starting to talk about this, because I remembered the things we'd been talking about earlier when we were talking about the sex chapter. But the thing I was actually going to talk about, was thinking about, was that first words of love in that quotation from Merleau-Ponty. So maybe think of that. If you've been involved with someone and you've been spending time with them, and you've got this growing sense that there could be something between you. When you guys say that to each other, and you say, I love you, however you put it, you have the experience, typically, you have the experience of those words, not just referring to something that is already the case, but you have the sense of those words referring to something that is basically being brought into being by the expressing of those words. Right? And as a incipient couple speaks, the members of it speak to each other about their desire to be a couple, a new world is born, a new world is brought into being, and you feel your words not just to be words that are clothings for a concept or something like that. You feel your words to be carving out a new life for you, a new world. So that was the last point I wanted to make about our everyday uses of language. So first I was talking about the easy usage where words so seamlessly allow us to communicate about reality that they seem almost unnecessary. Then I talked about the loss, being a loss for words, and how that negatively, that sort of shows you that, but if you don't have the words, you don't have the reality. And then positively, in this last one, I was trying to show you how the words actually bring that reality into being. It's only in having the words that you have a reality, and you can see, there's a new reality that is announced that is brought into being through the very words that announce it. First words of love are like that, but there would be other ones too, and the ones that he also talks about. So when you imagine a great artist or a great philosopher, or by artist, let's say a novelist, because that's somebody who works in words. That person is, words are not just clothing a thing that's already there. Through that person's writing, they're carving out the work that they're giving to you. The philosopher, if you imagine Merleau-Ponty writing, he has a sense of where he's going to go, but in writing these words, I think he's probably having the experience of, it's like if you imagine drawing a map of the world, like his words are like drawing a map of the world, except the world is only being brought into being by the drawing of it. And you might have that experience in learning. Like sometimes people say words to you, they're just words, they're just English language words, but they transform your world, and it's through those words that you were brought into a new experience, and that's very, very powerful. So those are just some phenomenological reflections on our everyday experiences of language. So I want to put they're all ones he talks about in here. I want to put those on your mind as I now turn to his chapter to talk about some of with the specific things he says about language a bit more technically. And I want to start, though, not by going to the chapter, but by going way back to the very beginning of the book, page 7. I think the book's the first chapter starts on page 4. There's a preface before that. I'm ignoring that. But chapter 1, I think, of the introduction starts on page 4, I think. And so I want to go to page 7. It's one of the first big points Merleau-Ponty makes. And I want to do that. And then I'm going to jump ahead to the beginning of the chapter on other cells, which is on page 362. So I'm going to start by looking at page 7 and 362 and then gradually connect it back to these things I've just been saying about language. So the material from page 7 is in the first chapter of the introduction that's about sensation. I don't particularly want to talk about sensation, though it's a great topic. But I want to just say one or two things about the context, just so you can make sense of your reading. I already read to you one thing he says from this chapter. I think it was in the context of talking about the phantom limb. Excuse me, it's on page 9, where he says, at the elementary level of sensibility, we catch sight of a collaboration among partial stimuli and between the sensorial system and the motor system that, through a variable physiological constellation, keeps the sensation constant. I'm not going to go back and explain it again, but I'm just reminding you of that thing I read. What's the point? We tend to think of sensation as a sort of causal thing, stimulus and reaction. That there's just a bunch of information given to us, and consequently we commonly think of experience or knowledge as a matter of information processing. And those are the ideas that Merleau-Ponty is challenging. He's trying to show that's wrong. And so that quotation I just read was part of him showing that sensation is not just sort of a mechanical delivery of a clear datum to a receptor, but rather that there is a dynamic process of the same thing he said in the Phantom Limb chapter, something like physical situation and behavioral response. I can't remember quite what the language was, but there is that back and forth of call and response, and it's a matter of bodily behavioral apprehension, and it's a norm governed activity, and so that means in a certain way there's a kind of interpretation or process of resolving the perceptual experience to a certain type of thing. When he talked about, in the Phantom Limb chapter, when he talked about the insect and substitution of the limb, he talked about an a priori of the species. And so, again, it's worth remembering then that, we've already seen this, that, different animals engage with and respond to their environment out of what matters to them. Not what matters to them at the level of personal desires, but what matters to them as ticks or leeches or wild rabbits or whatever they are, right? That's the a priori of the species. There are things that matter. That the thrush who has to break the snail on the rock or whatever. So the sensation is even at this most primitive level of sensation that we often wrongly imagine to be just mechanical. Those issues of I'll just use that word again, interpretation, are already at play. And so sensation is always meaningful. It's the way the environment speaks to what matters to that organism, whether it's a rabbit or the person. And so in this chapter, well, in the part of the chapter even before that quotation, where the next quotation is going to come from, Merleau-Ponty is really just starting to introduce this idea that, when in your philosophy classes you sometimes hear about sensations and so on, sense data, and he's trying to show that the putative entities of ours that come up in our sensory life that are often talked about in philosophy classes don't actually exist. If you describe the forms in which experience actually happens, you find that those people don't have experiences of the sort that some philosophical writers have claimed. And so he's trying to determine in what terms our sensory life actually happens. I've already given you a part of that, but the basic idea is that our perception is always of forms, of meaningful forms, not just data, but meaningful forms. But what's a form like? A form is like a meaningful whole. It's like a face. You perceive a face, and you get it as a whole. And whether it's turned this way or whether it's turned that way or whether it's turned that way, you see the same face. Even though turned this way, turned that way, and turned that way, what you're getting here is a completely different set of what would be sensory information. But those three different profiles are all seen by you as the same thing. Well, they're seen as profiles. You take yourself to be seeing exactly the same thing, even though the putative body of sensory data would be completely different in those cases. Excuse me. Also, when you see a face, seeing it as a whole is again quite different from seeing all the details that would make it up. And so generally when people see a face, there will be many things about that face that, though they have seen the face, they don't know what that detail is. With me, for example, I commonly don't notice the color of the eyes of the people that I see. Of course, they're physiologically available to my vision, but I could know a person. I could know a person for years and not be able to tell you what color eyes that person has because I've never noticed. So even though I've seen them over and over again, that feature has never been perceptually salient for me. Sometimes somebody might ask, what color eyes does that person have? And then I can look and I can see. So it's available to be seen. But when I see the face as a whole, that detail is not specified for me. It sort of falls into the background. I can zero in, so to speak, on the eyes, but then the larger context of the face recedes into the background. And so seeing things as wholes means that there is something like a figure in a background structure in your perception all the time. Seeing the thing as a whole means that the differentiation, the specified, explicitly differentiated parts fall into the background. And you have to stop grasping it as a whole and sort of look into it to then have those features become perceptually salient to you. But in that case, the face as a whole recedes into the background. That's sort of looking in, and looking out, it's the same. You can be looking at a face, and of course that face is situated in a larger spatial environment. But in as much as you are noticing that face, typically that spatial environment will have fallen into the background, and you won't know it's there. And so if suddenly if you were in a room, let's say, talking to someone, and suddenly it goes black, and somebody said, what was in that room? There's a very good chance you won't be able to say what was there, even though it had been, so to speak, staring you in the face all the time, because that was in the background of your perception. So perceptually, the face was determinate for you, but the background was perceptually indeterminate. The whole is determinate, but the specific features are perceptually indeterminate. You can turn your attention to the background and have those things become perceptually definite and determinate for you. But in that experience, the face as a whole now becomes indeterminate and falls into the background of your perception. In any perception, there will be that structure. There will be dimensions of indeterminacy. So now let me bring you to the quotation. So this is page 7. He says, speaking about this kind of stuff, he says about 8 lines down, 7 or 8 lines down, we must recognize the indeterminate as a positive phenomenon. Quality appears within this atmosphere. We must recognize the indeterminate as a positive phenomenon. So the point there is, it is integral to our experiencing, to the world of our experience, that it is not just a matter of a fully specified fact that is handed to us, right? Which is how we generally think of the objective world, and that's part of the theme of objectivity that we've been critically reflecting on all along. Rather, the given form of experience is that aspects of it do not have their precise character specified for us experientially. And that also means that when we do have aspects of our perceptual experience specified determinately, that has come about through a kind of collaboration between the environment and us, right? We have become involved in it and come to see that part of our experience, come to experience that part of our experience as this significant thing based on how we attend to, how we orient ourselves towards engagement. Think about nature. People often say, though, they like to go into nature, and maybe that's true. I mean, mostly I think it's not really true. What people want to do is go to a campground. So they want an entertainment site, or they want to go look at a moving, sublime vista. There's great things to do. And no doubt those things do both relate to nature, but that's different from nature understood in the way Aristotle or Kant or Spinoza might talk about it when they're talking about that, when they're talking about physis, when they're talking about that self-organizing reality that is the happening of being as such. It's certainly true that when you go out and see the beautiful sunset, it is nature that you're seeing, but it's not like you're seeing nature in itself. You're seeing nature in light of a set of concerns and interests you have. And when you're camping, you're camping in nature because there are trees there, but the tree is for you a setting for your tent and a setting for your campfire and a setting for your hike, right? All I'm trying to get at is it's not none of those things is a pure apprehension of the fact in itself. All of them, each of them is a specific way of experiencing nature as this or that. There's a really nice book by Alexander Wilson called The Culture of Nature, and I think the first chapter is about campgrounds, and he talks about the way that campgrounds more or less came into existence in the United States as a byproduct or supplement to the building of the interstate road system, so that with the car industry and the desire of car companies to sell cars and the collaboration of the governments in building highways across the whole country so that people could use their cars to drive across the country, and corresponding demise of the railway system, they built campgrounds too, so that people could have a little dose of nature. But in a way, what that shows is that when you go to the campground, you're not going to nature. When you're going to the campground, that's a way of participating in a facet of car culture, right? And the whole systematic world that is built around that, the way of experiencing what is possible and what is available to you, that comes out of that culture. So it's not nature. It's a part of the experience of a very distinctive kind of 20th and 21st century person who's wrapped up in driving cars with interstate highways, et cetera, et cetera. And that too, has to do with the liberal culture that fosters the kind of individualism, like one car, one person, one car, one family, whatever. And it really at least emphasizes the nuclear family that's going to drive in the car, and it's against public transit and so on. Like there's an awful lot of social and personal interpretation built into that culture, and campgrounds are a piece of that. And so it's not, campgrounds aren't a neutral seeing of nature, right? They're part of a way of participating in that whole worldview. So anyway, so I just want to quickly give a couple of examples around this notion of nature to bring out this idea that even though we sometimes say, I'm just seeing X, and by X we then name what we take to be an objective fact in the world, generally speaking, that's not what's happening. Generally speaking, we're involved in a kind of seeing as or experiencing as, which is apprehending something from out of a set of concerns and so on we have. And the way what it is possible to experience has come to be a specific and determinate experience for us can't be separated from that orienting set of concerns for which that thing is now a determinate appearing. So determinacy then in experience is not just the given neutral fact of everything being already specified. Determinacy on the contrary is what comes about as the interacting between an organism or an experiencing person and an environment and a world. And the way the determinacy you experience is determinate bears within it the traces of those concerns. Right? Its determinacy reflects the perspective that is brought to it, and that determinacy is itself contextualized by or against the background of all kinds of other stuff that could be perceived that hasn't been or isn't being perceived. Other ways of perceiving the same thing, and also all those things you haven't noticed yet. So let me just go back to the thing on page 7. Let me actually go to page 6. Like, the context in which he says it is a very simple one. He draws these two pictures at the bottom of page 6, which is on the one hand a line with arrowheads pointing outwards, on the other hand a line with arrowheads pointing inward. And the point here is that if people describe the way they actually see this, pretty universally people see the top one is shorter than the bottom one. The inside line, they see the top inside line is shorter than the bottom inside line. But if you bring out a ruler, you see that that's not so. You see that they're quantitatively identical. So the point he's trying to make there is it's this whole and part thing I was saying. Like, you don't see those lines as each a mathematically discrete part, such that the image of the line with the arrowhead is a sum of a set of discrete parts that have been added together. On the contrary, that is a whole. And just as the faces I see don't particularly have blue or brown eyes, that guy with the two arrowheads doesn't have the mathematical length of its interior line specified, just like the blueness of the eyes isn't specified. I can look and see that there are blue eyes, and I can look at someone else's face and see that they also have blue eyes, and it turns out, it's the same color blue. Like, we could take a photograph of it and get a color wheel out and say, it's the same kind of blue. But in looking at the two people, I might they might look to me quite different. Their eyes might even look to me quite different. So here, you can bring out the ruler and you can measure those two things, which is to say you can take the lines out of their actual perceptual context, and by performing that kind of violent operation on them, produce mathematically equal lines. But that's not the way they function in experience. So it's not the case that we perceive first these sort of factual objective givens and then build up larger things. No, we first experience these meaningful wholes, like the face or the compressed line with the arrowheads or the expanded line with the other arrowheads. And those, each of those is a kind of world unto itself. And any part you see is kind of reflecting the whole. Anything you see about this is reflecting the face, right? You don't see it as discrete parts unless you do a kind of violence on your perception and focus in on what color are those eyes, what shape is that nose. But normally everything is just part of communicating that expression that is that face. And similarly, everything just is communicating this image or that image and the kind of perceptual meaning they have. And so those two images are not actually perceived as belonging to the same kind of space. Those lines are each in their own separate world. And in that respect, it's kind of like the talk of live space or situational space, and the idea that we inhabit spaces in ways that have these local meanings, such that the space in our home is experientially discontinuous with the space 14 inches away from that, which is the neighbor's house, even though mathematically and physically they're completely continuous. It's a similar kind of point. Anyway, so I'll stop there. But the thing I'm trying to get at there is to show you quickly some of the connection between the points here about perceptual wholes and the things we were saying before about space, and to bring together the problem of wrongly presuming our experience to be quantitatively positional and neutral and so on, as that comes up here in this example, and as we talked about that with live space, and all of that in the service of saying our perception always takes the form of a figure and background, and what that means is meaningful perception. The determinacies of perception are always the result of the kind of resolution that is the result of a meaningful engagement between the perceiver and the perceived, that is a kind of rendering determinate in a context of indeterminacy, right? And as he says, we have to recognize the indeterminate as a positive phenomenon. Okay, that was a little bit of a return to that first chapter of the book, so that's just a little extra study for you. But the whole point about that is I want to just bring out that notion of indeterminacy and say, look, that's our whole situation. Like, you're born, and it's not given what the world is and what you are. You're given to yourself kind of as a question. And you are going to, your experience is going to be a process of bringing to resolution a sense of who you are and who that world is. Let me skip ahead to the other thing I want to quote from the very beginning of the chapter on other selves. It was on 362. I'm going to actually come back to 361 in a minute, I think, but 362 I want to say this. He says, this is about almost right in the middle of the page. After a thing that he has in parentheses, he says, and since, in short, I am never at one with myself, such is the fate of a being who is born, that is, a being who once and for all was given to himself as something to be understood. Again, that'd be a perfect place for launching into Derrida, because that's Derrida's philosophy really focuses around that idea of that nothing is ever one with itself. We can talk about that some other time. But here, we connect this back with what I was saying before about time and being born and so on. You're born as a kind of question to yourself, and your experience is always one dimension of your experience is an answer to that question. And it's that question of who am I? What is this? Right? And so even as you operate in a world, going out and buying your groceries, doing your homework, taking care of your children, whatever it is that you're doing, that's all taking place in a context of, at some level, having answered the question, right? So I said before, the going out to nature or seeing whatever it is we're seeing as determinate was a matter of resolving an indeterminate situation, right? Well, so that meaningful perception is a kind of a question and answer. There was a indeterminate situation with the question, what is this? And that gets answered by our interested engagement with it. Well, you live on the basis of an answer to that question. Go back to the habit body, right? That's what you were doing. You were building up an interpretation of what the world is, an interpretation of who you were in that. And that's kind of, that's what Merleau-Ponty said when he talked about the phantom limb. Like, you've come to experience the world as a place in which one walks. And so situations present themselves to you as to be walked in, and that calls up from your body the need to use this leg, which you no longer have, and hence the phantom limb. But so that, the point that Merleau-Ponty was making about habit, about and using the language of being in the world, is that we have become habituated to, I'll use this word again, to interpreting the world as a certain kind of place and interpreting ourselves as a certain kind of place. Interpreting not in the sense of explicitly pondering, what is this? Oh, I interpret it as blah, blah, blah. Not that. Interpreting just in the sense of taking it up in a specific way. Yeah, let me just leave it at that for the moment. So the point I wanted to bring out here then was that idea that our existence is always that question and answer process. And as he says, you're a being that's never going to be at one with yourself, right? That answer is never quite measures up to the question. Right? It doesn't end the indeterminacy. It doesn't close the project. In fact, I wonder if I can read that thing about the. Oh, I have a piece of paper where I noted a few passages. Yeah. He says here on 366. A 366, 4 lines down, he says, I have the world as an unfinished individual through my body as a power for this world. I mean, that's a version of the same thing. Like the world is the unfinished individual. I guess you could mean different things by that. But I guess what I'm going to take it to mean for the purpose of the things we're talking about here is it's not a sealed and complete package, both in the sense that it invites and requires your ongoing involvement, and also in the sense that its own edges at the horizon. There's a horizon to your perception, and beyond those edges, like it's you haven't sorted that out yet, you know. And so he says it a few more lines down. He says the ideal of objective thought is grounded upon my perception of the world as an individual in harmony with itself. So you live out of let's say an expectation that the world is going to be in harmony with itself. And again, that's not exactly a fact. That's an expectation. That's an orientation. I mean, this would take us right back to Kant and talking about what do you have to bring with you to be able to experience the object as real. Well, it's a version of that. Like our experience brings with it the expectation that the object is going to be a world, which is to say an individual in harmony with itself. And point one. And point two, the way we experience that world as we don't fully experience it as harmony with itself because it's an unfinished individual, but we experience it as sort of living up to that demand or living up to that expectation. The way we experience it as meaningfully giving itself as a response to that expectation, as a fulfillment of that expectation, is through the meaningful ways we also interact with it with our body, right? So the ability of the world to be experienced as an individual in harmony with itself can't be separated from us, from our living bodily engagement with it and the correlative meaning of my body. And so Merleau-Ponty is saying, like, that's the experiential precondition for even having the idea of an objective world. So again, I'm not going to keep pursuing that further. I'm just trying to connect up some ideas we already had with some other words here, but also just to continue to expand the sense of the lived world versus the world as an object and what their relations are. But now, so I still want to go back to one more thing from this chapter, and then we're going to bring it back to language. This last thing about how you are a unity, and I was saying, you're an answer to your question. You start off kind of indeterminate and so on. We talked before, well, and I've talked about birth. You're born as a kind of question. Your life is a kind of effort to answer that. Your death, that would be the end of your story. Normally, the end would be the completion. It doesn't quite work that way. So again, I'm going to pick up on that theme that I repeatedly recurred to from the chapter on the experience of the body in classical psychology, where Merleau-Ponty was trying to emphasize that the necessity of the body in your experience is quite different from the necessity that characterizes objects. And so he said it therefore can't be a factual necessity. And he said if there's a necessity to objects, that's a physical necessity, this is a metaphysical necessity. He said, he uses another expression too, I can't remember what it was, and I compared it to empirical versus transcendental in Kant. Well, and I've used that a couple of times before. I want to use it again here. In your experience, and the point I'm going to make here is very similar to the point he makes in that classical psychology thing, right, where he says to experience something as an object means it's a thing you can walk around and it can be follow to your view and so on. And therefore you can't really experience your body properly as an object because it can't ever follow to your view. You can't see it from certain sides and so on. It's a point very similar to that. You experience all kinds of things in the world as ending. A song begins and ends. Somebody else's life begins and ends. A chair has, precise limits, right? All the thing, pretty much everything you see, insofar as it is determinate, has its ends, has its limits, is complete. So there is a kind of factual completeness to the things in experience. Completeness is a characteristic of the objects of experience, things that are experienced. Your life is never going to be complete in that way, right? Because that very notion of completeness presumes that object is contextualized by others. There's a surrounding world that is on the other, like, if the chair ends here, there's a world on the other side of that. There's a world outside it. If a song ends at a certain time, there's more time after that. Well, you can't, your experience can't be completed in that sense, because there isn't any other side to it that you can have experience of, because X hypothesized that's the end of your experience. So I made that point already about birth and death. Like they're and the unsurpassable limits in/of our experience. They're definitive of our experience, but we actually can't experience them as such. But anyway, so I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm just trying to remind you of that. But so now it's like, so now the question is, I'm trying to figure out who I am. Well, the problem is you're an unfinished individual too. Like, your life keeps unfolding and so on. And so there's a question, a kind of permanent question to you that is definitive of your existence. And the whole history of your experience is an answering of that, but it's not fully a settling of it. And this is relevant to the question of time. And so let's just look at this. So in other words, I want this not just to be a logical point, but a meaningful life point, an existential point. So let's look at the bottom of 361. He says, well, actually, this is just eight lines into the beginning of chapter 4 here. He says, I currently understand my first 25 years as a prolonged childhood that had to be followed by a difficult weaning process in order to arrive finally at autonomy. Like, he's just talking about the way that some imaginary person imagines his or her life. Now I see that's what I was doing. At the time, it didn't look that way to me, but now I realize that's what was actually happening. If I think back to those years such as I lived them, and such as I now carry them with me, their happiness refuses to be explained by the protected atmosphere of the parental milieu, because the world itself was more beautiful, things were more fascinating, and so I can never be certain of understanding my past better than it understood itself while I lived it, nor can I silence my protests. Anyway, the point just is that as you lived it, it seemed one way. Now you look back and you say, oh, it's this. But those things don't just neatly match up. And the fact that your perspective now makes this one seem more convincing to you doesn't automatically trump how the things seemed to you before. So, you used to think the world was more beautiful. Now you think, oh, that's just how it seemed to me because I lived in the protective environment of my parents. He says, yeah, you can say that. That's a way for you to have a kind of theory of your past and a way to interpret it. But the past doesn't just acquiesce to that and slip into that without protest. And so he says, My current interpretation, emphasizing that word, which I've been trying to use in various ways so far, my current interpretation is tied to my confidence in psychoanalysis, which is saying, oh, we're going to sort out your experience and find out what your past was about. But tomorrow, with more maturity and more insight, I will perhaps understand my past differently again, and I will accordingly construct it differently. So my hold on the past and my hold on the future are precarious. And my full possession of my own time is always deferred until the moment when I fully understand myself. But, as I was just saying about death, that moment will never arrive. Since if it did arrive, it would be another moment in time, and hence subject to subsequent reevaluation. So that's the idea. You can't the task of understanding your life in that sense can't be completed. So anyway, I want just to take you to those few passages from the beginning of the chapter on other selves, which is another quite nice reflection on lived time that complements the things I was already saying about the Phantom Limb chapter. But I want to say that because I wanted you to really start thinking about this idea that what's most deeply at issue in all these things is our making sense of ourselves, which is inseparable from the issue of our making sense of the world. Because we are a being in situation, making sense of ourselves is always making sense of those two sides correlatively. And so we can ask about phantom limbs, and we can talk about the experience of home, all of which is quite interesting and quite important. But all of that is really contextualized at root by the deepest issue of what it is to be a living being, to be an existing human being, and that is to be unrelentingly and unsurpassably involved in the task of answering that question. Who am I and what is this place? Now, again, as I said when talking about the phantom limb, generally we have an answer to that. We have answered it. So even though that's our defining question, we don't always acknowledge that. We don't always live the question as continuing to question. We often live that question as having been answered, and we are settled and complacent in our lives. So let's now skip to that for a second. You do find yourself in a world where it seems like a lot of that stuff is answered. You know what the world is? It's a planet in our solar system, in the Milky Way galaxy, and if you're near me, you're in the continent of North America, and it's the time of recording, it's 2020, and you're a university student or a single father or whatever you are. You figure out you got a lot of answers to the world. We live in a capitalist democracy, or whatever. You have a lot of answers to what the world is. You have a lot of answers to what you are, and you don't raise those questions. You live on the basis of them, and those are what you think of as facts. It's the objective world. And then, because it seems to you that that's settled, the world seems just to have a factual character. Well, so what then is language, right? Well, language would seem to be, the convenient sounds we've made up to pick out this and that. So the thought would be, the way we have of thinking would be this: since the world has this character, we have developed words that match up to that character of the world, right? So it is the world we treat as having a sense in itself. It's a fact. And language then is just a derivative representation of that, a derivative way of matching up to what is already the character of things. Now, the point that Merleau-Ponty, and I have been making about determinacy in experience, though, already should let you think, well, I guess that's not right. So if the things that we've been saying today and for the last couple of weeks or couple of sessions are right, then that putatively factual character of the world is not just a given sense that imposes itself on you, but is rather a resolution, something that's been resolved through the meaningful action of you and probably other people and an environment. And it is a resolution that is itself not neutral, but is reflective of the kinds of interests and concerns that have come to it. So it's a seeing as. It's not just a neutral seeing, so to speak. And in that case, then the language. So Merleau-Ponty says, language can seem to you to be just that neutral derivative carrier of an already existent sense, only because it's the language that's already been established and you're habituated to it. So basically what he's saying is language is the way we establish our recognitions of determinacy. In language, we say what we see in that kind of performative sense of say. We say what we see in the sense that we give voice to what aspect or what significance of things we're going to recognize. And so the language doesn't so much copy an already existent factual sense as it articulates the terms in which the world will be experientially available. And so we commonly live with a world in which we're habituated to those terms, habituated to that language. And so we just take it for granted that the sense the language communicates is the neutral objective one, and then the language seems like the derivative follower. But that's because we're not really noticing language in its most defining and essentially generative function. So that brings us back to some of those reflections I was making on our ordinary use of language, and I was talking about kind of original kind of speech in which you speak a kind of reality into existence. When you and your partner say, "Yeah, we love each other. I love you. I love you. Let's get married." There you've announced yourself as being in love. Were you or were you not? No. We treat love as if it were kind of a factual thing, but that's not so much the case. It's more like by saying those things, you express how you're going to relate to that person, or at least how you propose to do that. And if the person says back to you, "I love you too," that's an acceptance of that. And then the two of you launch into that new interpretation of yourselves, which is not a theoretical cognitive interpretation, although it's that too. It's a way of life in which you enact a new shared identity. But saying "I was in love with you" didn't so much just refer accurately to an already existent fact in the world. It rather, with good motivation, projected a new way of experiencing your interactions. And you came to inhabit that new way of living yourselves in inhabiting that language and accepting that language. And so language in general is our effort to give voice to the sense we are willing to recognize in things, and it's in using that language that sense in a way comes to determinacy and takes shape. There's an example I didn't use when I was talking about the everyday experience of language, but I think I'll just mention it now because I think it might help to do this. Like if you've ever written an essay, at least if the essay's any good, you probably had a sense of what you were going to do, but you didn't really know, and you sat about writing it and you had to struggle. And if you've ever written a good essay, you should have the experience that through that essay, through the writing of it, you actually learned something, right? Through the effort to articulate those thoughts, you actually were able to have those thoughts. So before that, you had a vague sense that there was something there, but you had to give voice to it to get it. So it's in essentially inventing the words for it that the thought is able to be realized and is able to exist for you, and then you have it. And then once you have it, you could describe it in different words. But the original coming to have the thought can't be separated from the experience of trying to and succeeding at expressing it. It's a language. That's why language is, in school, in philosophy, language is so important. Like, learn your grammar, learn your spelling, because it is your capacity to, and learn your creative, imaginative use of language. It's your capacity to work in language that is your capacity to work in thought. And it's in the language that the thinking actually happens. Well, so in a similar way, it's in coming to express that we come to have a world. Like we try to say what it is, and we kind of say it into existence, and the world then becomes available to us and able to be said in other ways. And so that's the distinction Merleau-Ponty makes between what he refers to variously as first or second order speech, or speaking versus spoken speech, or sometimes he refers to the one as authentic speech. I don't remember if he refers to the other one as inauthentic, but that would be the implication. Inauthentic because it, and so the difference is between language that we are using and experiencing ourselves as using it in a way that is experientially transformative, versus using language that's like a well-oiled machine, right? Using language where the thing you're saying in that language has already been said. Like when you say, I go to the store. I'm going to go to the store now. Like it's not a struggle to give voice to your experience there. You really are just referring to an already established way of talking about things. And so it's easy to say, and so it's just it's a reiteration of familiarity. It's not the inauguration of a new experience. And so that's I'm going to the store to get milk is second order speech. It's already spoken speech. But when you come to that person and you say, I love you, that's speaking speech. Those are words that are hard to say. They carry the whole weight of your existence, and they're words that in being said transform the very world they're talking about. And so that's first order speech. So that's authentic speech, because that's speech in which its existential weight, its transformative character, its realization of freedom is manifest. Second order speech, I guess, would be inauthentic, because it's the use of language in which the reality of language is concealed. It's the expression of choices where the fact that they're choices is not acknowledged, because they become habituated to the point that they just seem like the way things are. And so he says it's that second order speech, it's that's already instituted speech that gives us, he says, I think it's on 188. Yeah, the top of 188. Actually, the bottom of 187, the top of 188. Bottom of 187. 88 and 89. The bottom of 188 and the top of 189. He says, what tricks us here, what makes us believe in a thought that could exist for itself prior to expression, and you could also say of a world that exists independent of expression, are the already constituted and already expressed thoughts that we can silently recall to ourselves, and by which we give ourselves the illusion of an inner life. And then later down on 189 he says, we live in a world where speech is already instituted. That's about 2/3 of the way down the page. We possess in ourselves already formed significations for all those banal words. And so they give rise in us only to second order thoughts, which are in turn translated into other words that require no genuine effort of expression from us, and similarly that will demand no effort of comprehension from our listeners. Thus, language and the comprehension of language seem self-evident. Anyway, so he's just talking there about the way that we have come, personally and collectively, to inhabit a world where the parameters of that world are basically coextensive with the terms of our language. And because it's our home world, because we're familiar with it, we take it just to be a matter of fact. And consequently, language is easy because we act it as if it's just picking out facts, and we don't think of it as doing anything, and we don't think of the world as actually needing that language. And of course, those things, based on what we're saying, are all mistaken. There's one other thing I wanted to say there. It's just slipped my mind. What was it? It was when he said it requires no effort. Oh yeah, I was saying, when you go to buy milk in the grocery store, I was saying this a little bit earlier when I was talking about everyday language. Like, it's so amazing that you can read another person's mind. They can tell you what they're thinking, and you guys can share this thought. Well, then that's an important point about the language here, right? This language, the very nature of the language is that it's not just you and your own private things. The very nature of language is that it is a shared way of seeing things. It's the language gives voice to a shared perception. And so in developing a language, you're answering the question who you are, or in adopting a language, you're answering the question who you are, you're answering the question what the world is, and you're doing that simultaneously with answering the question who everybody else is. And it is the enactment of your learning a language is the enactment of your participation in a kind of a we, right? As Hegel would say, going back to the I that is we and we that is I, a kind of collective shared way of perceiving what our situation is. So language then is the well, actually, so I do want to go on and talk about the experience of others in language, but the point I want to make about the story is quickly this. Merleau-Ponty says, it requires no effort at expression. You can get in situations with people where the stuff you want to say does require effort at expression and effort at understanding. And it's at that point that you start to discover that other side of our experience of other people, that they're enigmas, right? People can try to tell you about things and you don't get what they're saying, or they don't get what you're saying. I'm not talking about just, sloppy language. I'm saying that there can be things that people are really trying to communicate for which you don't actually have that shared thing yet. Even like I love you, when that person comes to you and says I love you, like they're hoping that they're giving voice to an experience that you guys were already more or less sharing, and sometimes that doesn't quite happen, and then you realize, oh, I don't quite know where you're coming from, and then you discover a sense that that other person was more alien to you than you thought, right? And so yes, we have that experience I talked about at the beginning when I was talking about everyday uses of language. Yes, we have that experience that other people are in a way transparent to us. That's part of the reality of second order speech. But we also can have, and it's important that we do have that experience of our alienness to other people. Other people are really other people. And that's when second order speech fails. Maybe you experience that too in sort of cross-cultural things sometimes, where each of you has your own way of talking about things and thinking about things, and you think everything's obvious. But what you say to the other person and what they say to you, and everything else about expressing your view of the world don't fit, and the other person just seems strange and enigmatic. Commonly what we do then is think, oh, those other people are idiots, and our way is the obvious one, and that's what they're thinking about us. But of course, the reality is that what both people are doing is, in encountering that other, coming up upon the reality that their personal or cultural way of seeing things isn't the whole story. Their way of answering the question, who am I, who are we, what is this place, is not hasn't got rid of that question, right? And so those clashes should be the opportunity to ask that question freshly, right? Just like in personal exchanges, breakdowns of communication can be the opportunity to try to get to know who you're dealing with in a new way, right? Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. I wanted to go back though and just go back to this theme of language as inherently a matter of establishing a kind of shared perception, or realizing a kind of sharedness of perception. I'm just going to pause for a second and then I'll come back to that.
So But this is basically the last point I want to make, I think. Um, and it's just basically about the nature of gesture, bodily gestures. Uh, but so I want you to think about a gesture. And this is an example Merleau-Ponty uses in one of these chapters. I can't remember where it is. It's in one of the later chapters, I think, but I'm not sure what. Anyway, but it's the example of, you point over there to a landscape to get somebody else to look at it. I say, look over there, and you go, yeah, right. So I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that gesture of pointing. I go, look at that thing over there. So when I point, I do this thing with my hand. Somebody else, the person I'm with, notices that and basically looks with me where the hand was pointing. So the other person apprehends my body correctly when she or he or there, whoever it is, experiences my body not as something to look at, but as something effectively to look through, or even to look, you might even say to look with. My hand becomes for that person something that shapes their perspective and moves them to see the thing they're supposed to see. So they basically see through my hand. And the hand works when it gets you to apprehend what I was experiencing, or more exactly, it gets you. It works when you see my hand correctly, when through it or with it you see the experience I was having that I wanted to share with you and that I thought was shareable with you. And when you then apprehend it, my experience, what I was after, is satisfied at the same time that yours is. We share the experience of looking at that thing, a sharedness of experience that was accomplished by my hand. And so my hand became basically the bearer of that sense, that meaning of the shared experience. So just think about the body in that context. If I try to point to you and you don't get it, you look at my hand and think, "What? Why is that finger sticking up there in the air?" Then it wasn't a pointer, and it didn't do what it was supposed to do. Similarly, if I'm just waving my hand around talking about something and you think I'm pointing at the thing, you say, "Oh yeah, I see what you're pointing at." That's also wrong. That didn't really happen, right? The hand really worked as a pointer only when we both shared our perception of what it was, namely a pointer, and for us to share our perception of it as a pointer is for us to try to join into what it was, the experience it was pointing to, right? It is a pointer when we share the experience of the pointer, which is when we both are oriented toward what it was pointing to, right? And so that the hand, the finger, whatever it is, my finger becomes the bearer of our shared perspective, our shared experience. That means my hand has become language. And that's what it means for the body to be expressive, an expression. My body became an expression. It became language. My body became, just to repeat those words, it became the bearer of a shared meaning. That's roughly what happens when I say, "Oh, I'm going to the store." Those sounds weren't heard by you as sounds. They immediately communicated to you that meaning that I was trying to share with you. But like the finger, like they're sounds. So they are again a kind of piece of the material world, piece of physical nature that is existing for us as a bearer of shared meaning. And it's only because we both recognize them as those sounds as language, and because recognize them as language is apprehending the sense that they communicate, right? It's only in my knowing now that you're going to the store that those words, in fact, were language, right? But so the words function as language in exactly the same way that my finger functions as language when it makes this pointing gesture. So I want you to think about gesture in general and in that kind of way. So Merleau-Ponty makes this point in a couple places. He makes it in the chapter we're reading on the body as expression on page 190, when he talks about anger. And then he makes it again in the chapter on others, on 368, I think it is. Yeah, on 368, when he talks about a 15-month-old child biting. So I'll just talk about those two examples a little bit. So talking about gesture, I was just giving the example of the pointer. Like, what happens with the pointer? You do recognize his pointing all the time. So you don't come upon a finger and think, oh, why is that person sticking a finger out in the air? Rather, you allow my finger to guide your perception. Just as an aside, in those same pages where I'm going to go to, where he talks about the child biting, he talks about what he calls, I think he calls it this, a shared body schema. If he doesn't use those words, he makes that point, which is to say, you just as we were talking about the body schema before, I think I talked about this when we were talking about sexuality, and how you live out of your body as a certain set of powers and so on. You have a sense of them. He's saying you live out of another person's body that way too. When my hand is a pointer, my body is in effect becoming your body, right? Right. So I just wanted to talk about that kind of inhabiting of the other person's body, that it becomes an articulator of my experience at the same time that it's an articulator of your experience. I guess there I was talking about your body articulating my experience at the same time it articulates yours. Anyway, let's go back to the example of anger from page 190. When think about gestures people make, they go, oh, I suppose a surprise. I'm going to do obviously caricatures now because I wasn't actually surprised. But sometimes you're like, oh, you make dismissive gestures, or there's probably an expression of fear. You could think of happiness, and you're happy to see someone and so on. Those are, all of those gestures are like the pointer, in that we experience them as expressions. We experience them as another's body taking us into a sharing of that person's experience. And so he says, with anger, when somebody's making the gestures of anger, I don't experience myself as encountering signs, and then I reflectively think about it and calculate out that, oh, probably in that person's inner representational cognitive mind, they're having angry views about things, right? You don't have that multi-step process, either in the sense of going through a cognitive process or in the sense of recognizing one thing and using it as a clue for some other thing. On the contrary, when someone makes angry gestures, I actually experience myself as being confronted with someone's anger, right? That person's mood is in the world now shaping my experience. And I might or might not explicitly notice, if you ask me, what are the expressions of anger? I couldn't actually tell you. I'd have to try to act angry, like I can act dismissive, and then I could go back and watch this videotape, and I could say, oh yeah, that's what you do when you want to express that you're being dismissive of something. And probably similarly with anger, if I were to get angry now, I could watch this videotape back and say, oh yeah, that's how you make an angry expression. I don't really know. Just like I don't know that people have blue eyes so often when I see them, or brown eyes. I don't really know what the shaping of the face and the shoulders and the arms or whatever it is you use. I don't really know what those things are that communicate anger, because I perceive anger. And so I perceive anger through basically the physiognomy of anger. I pursue anger through the comportment of the body that communicates anger. And I grasp anger like I grasp pointing. Let's go back to the other example. Well, actually, let me read, first of all, that thing about anger that I referred to. I wish I could read the landscape one. I wish I could remember what that is. But anyway, he says, modern psychology has shown that this is page 190. Modern psychology has shown that the spectator does not look within himself or within his inner experience for the sense of gestures he witnesses, right? So you don't see something and think, oh, someone's shaping their face that way. I wonder what it is. Let me just hunt around for my own experiences and see what match. Like, you don't go through any process like that. So he says, think about an angry or a threatening gesture. In order to understand those gestures, I have no need of recalling the feelings I experienced when I made a gesture that looked like that, a similar gesture. He says, I have from the inside quite a limited knowledge of the gesture of anger. Well, that was the point I was just making. Like, I don't really know what it's like. I can do it. I don't know what it's like. And so it's not, that's not how I work this out. And I also don't perceive the anger or the threat as a psychological fact hidden behind the gesture, right? I don't see the thing, as I was saying before, and then theoretically construct what must be going on in someone's private subjectivity. Rather, he says, I read the anger in the gesture. The gesture does not make me think of anger. It is the anger. So that I'm just reading because we're saying essentially the same thing I was trying to explain. Now let's skip ahead to 368. So here he says, he says, well, let's say I'm playing with a 15-month-old baby. Do you still call 15-month-olds babies? Maybe. Toddler. Could be an infant still. Anyway, a 15-month-old opens his mouth when I playfully take one of his fingers in my mouth and pretend to bite it. Yeah, so like I go. But when I do that, the infant also goes, and what he's saying there is, so he's talking about that situation. He's saying what's happening there is that just as I was describing when I recognize anger, the infant grasps the playfulness of my gesture, and actually, playing along in the game reproduces that same gesture. Not exactly copying. The child isn't sitting there thinking, "Oh, how would I copy that?" It's more that the child rises up to meet what I offer with his own offering. And but the amazing thing is the child does the same thing. And so the point Merleau-Ponty wants to make is that infant can't go through that process of saying, I see this expression on that person's face, so now I'm going to make this expression on my face and calculate how that happens. He says that couldn't be the case because a child at that age doesn't actually have an experience of knowing what he or she or they look like. It's true that that child may well have experienced mirrors, but generally speaking, from what I understand of child psychology, the mirrors are not really experienced as such by children until somewhere between roughly 12 and 18 months. And so a 15-month-old is just barely at the stage where mirrors are even meaning anything to it, and it's a new discovery for the child to think, hey, that's me, and to learn to associate his or her living sense of himself with that image. Right? And so the point is that this is not a child who knows what his face looks like and knows how to do things on it by as he would manipulate an object. What's happening when the child smiles is the child from the inside expresses the same meaning that the child recognizes from the outside when he sees me express it. So it's not a matter of trying to duplicate a visual image of a circle in the mouth, whatever. It's not a matter of trying to duplicate something physically recognized in the medium of the child's own mouth. It's a matter of responding to an expressed attitude with an expression of that same attitude. And the child's expression of the attitude spontaneously does basically the same thing that I did. And so what he's saying, what does that show you? It shows that the child got what I was expressing. And the child is doing and knows how to do the same thing. And the point Merleau-Ponty wants to make there is that this is kind of like the point about the a priori of the species. Like we're people, and we're beings for whom others are already included in our world. Our bodies already call for, in a sense, their completion in the bodies of others. Our experience inherently calls for its completion through the experience of others, right? We're beings such that the very meaning of who we are summons up sharing as its natural fulfillment. This is a different way into the topic, but that's surely very, very close to the issues of recognition that Hegel was talking about when he basically said, in our experience, we seek and depend upon the confirmation by others of our experience. Merleau-Ponty actually uses that language. I wonder if I can find it. It is also somewhere around 190. Yeah, it's actually 191. He says, this is about 10 lines down. Communication is accomplished when my behavior finds in this pathway its own pathway. Actually, let me read more because he's talking about another person. This is good, actually. So this is starting at the bottom 190. I'll read the whole thing. Communication, or the understanding of gestures, is achieved through the reciprocity between my intentions and the other person's gestures, and between my gestures and the intentions which can be read in the other person's behavior. So everything happens as if the other person's intention inhabited my body, or as if my intentions inhabited his body. So that's basically the same as that point about the shared body schema that I mentioned, which he brings up, I think, on around 370. The gesture I witness sketches out the first signs of an intentional object, and that object becomes present and is fully understood when the powers of my body adjust to it and fit over it. The gesture is in front of me like a question. It indicates to me specific sensible points in the world and invites me to join it there. So, and now finally the thing I was initially going to read. Communication is accomplished when my behavior finds in this pathway its own pathway. I confirm the other person and the other person confirms me. So the thing he said there really just reproduced. Well, I was going to say reproduced what I said. I guess I was reproducing what he said. But in any case, what I read there pretty much reproduces the things I was saying a couple minutes ago, concluding with that idea that what you're seeing in gesture/language expression is experiences of mutual confirmation, which is a kind of basically an experience of sharing. So that I'm just going over that because I made this side point about recognition, and I want to say, yeah, you can see he's really saying here that our experience is oriented towards sharing. It calls for sharing, which means we need our experience to be confirmed and fulfilled by others, and that is basically what Hegel was talking about with recognition when he said our experience needs to be confirmed by others. Anyway, so he says on 368, he says, as about halfway down the page, there is between my consciousness and my body, such as I live it, and between this phenomenal body and the other person's phenomenal body, such as I see it from the outside, an internal relation, right? So experiencing another person is not a matter of coming up against an alien world. It's coming up, it's encountering something that is already involved in who you are. It's not unlike the very notion of being in the world, with the idea that we don't go out and find that there is a world. We're already in the world. And it's a matter of, within that experience of the world, cultivating and enriching the articulate form of our engagement, where we're already with other people. And so our experiences of other people are the opportunities to develop and refine and enrich what it is that's happening when we're with those others. Yeah, so there is between these things an internal relation that makes the other person appear as the completion of the system. So I referred to this after the species, and so the point I was making then was this notion that other people are in a way already internal to us. We are in a world with others, and so our relations with others are a matter of cultivating and developing that reality of kind of coexistence that's already there. So let's just think then about what happens when Merleau-Ponty makes the face of this child, or when somebody. Well, yeah, let's stick with the child. Merleau-Ponty or whoever, whatever parent's doing that, whoever's looking at that child. The child is not a blank slate in the sense that the child is already in a world already with others. Stuff has already happened, but the child nonetheless is at the very beginnings of development, and it's pretty, in many ways, kind of open and amorphous. So what's happening when Merleau-Ponty, people like that make those gestures and do all the things they do with children, is they're inviting the child to participate in a kind of experience that's possible for people. Just when I point to you, I'm inviting you to participate in an experience that is shareable, that I'm having, that I want you to share, and I'm saying you join me in this thing we can do. And that's what Merleau-Ponty is doing when he's playing the biting game with the child. They're having fun, but those gestures, do you remember the distinction between sort of first and second order speech? Well, something similar is true here. Like those gestures for the growing child, the early gestures, are kind of inaugurating gestures. They're like first order speech, right? The child is in a way being shown, being initiated into the possibilities of emotional life, right? So you bring to the child love and probably anger, and kindness, I hope, and playfulness. You bring those emotions, like that's what you're really bringing. But how do you bring them? Well, you bring them in touching, you bring them in expressions, right? You don't bring them by creating a certain kind of cognitive content and by some mysterious means putting that cognitive content into the mind of the child. You behave lovingly towards the child. You behave kindly towards the child. And that attitude is embodied in certain ways of using your body, ways of touching, ways of acting, ways of making faces, ways of shaping, right? So your behavior is the living presentation of an attitude. And insofar as you do that with the child, you initiate the child into the experiences of love, kindness, anger, whatever those other ones are. And it's a human child, so those are possibilities for that child. And so the child initially receiving them is on the path to being able to take them on for herself and express them. So the child at one, no doubt cannot express anything like the depths of love or anger that you can as an adult. But you can make a biting gesture at the child's mouth, and the child can express that playfulness, right? You make low-level entries into playing. You don't set this bar too high, and the child can rise to that bar and play along with you. Bite your finger. So that that's what's happening in those gestures. The gestures of anger that you make over the course of the day to your friends are well known. They're like second order speech, and they're immediately available. Those gestures, when a child first confronts them, are inaugurations into a new world. I suppose in some cases they could be terrifying. They might also sometimes be puzzling because they're new. Like you think, what is this world? But the child is going to have to move into that world and come to inhabit it and habituate himself or themselves to it. So my point then is that I was talking about the experience of gesture, but now I'm talking about the inaugural experience of the gesture, right? The gesture when it presents to the child or whomever, I guess the child, a possibility from your experience that you're saying that child could share in. And the child's growing up amounts to, following that pointer, it amounts to coming to have your gesture articulate her experience, his experience, whatever it is, right? So it offers a world or an aspect of the world for that child to inhabit. And there are other things like that too. He says, talks about somewhere around here, very close to this. He talks about a child finding stuff around the house. Yeah, on 370 he says, Uh, you have this on 370 says you got tools and instruments and cultural things around the house. The child finds these objects around himself at birth, like meteorites from another planet. But he takes possession of them and learns to use them as others use them, because his body schema assures the immediate correspondence of what he sees done and what he does. And because in this way the utensil takes shape as a determinate manipulandum, thing to be handled, and the other person takes shape as a center of human action. In other words, when the child grows up, like there are already beds, doors, cellular telephones, flush toilets, locking doors, security systems, pens. There's all this stuff around, and for the child, they're like meteorites. Like they're not things that have been generated out of that child's world, but they are things that people can use, and the child will see you using them, and so very quickly the child will learn to do the same thing, because the child can rise to inhabiting the possibilities for its body that are put on display by our bodies as we use them, right? And so the child can grow into the use of these things, right? So those objects, in a way, are like gestures in that they invite the child to share in the experience they make possible by taking them up as bearers of shareable experience. And actually, so I wanted to talk about that, about gesture and so on. And really the point I want to get here is, it's the one that I was sort of ending with before, but the last little section, and it's the one I've just been talking about through all this, but I just want to emphasize it, right? The point is that language, or it is the material medium on the basis of which we establish a sharedness of living, a shared being in the world. And language is just a sophisticated version of pointing, right? It is a highly refined development of the basic capacity of the body to be the expression of your subjectivity. So when we develop words, it's kind of like when the blind person learns to use a cane, they're in a way like prostheses, right? We go beyond our naturally given resources and add on something that we've sort of shaped by craft. And we still use sounds, but it's not. But language isn't just the gestural capacity of a cry. It's sounds that in and of themselves have no natural meaning, but that artificial system of constructing it such that means door, means that thing you open. There's no connection intrinsically between those sounds, or there may be a very, very distant connection. Merleau-Ponty says in this chapter somewhere that maybe language begins with people singing the praises of the world or something like that. There may be at a very, very basic level certain kinds of psychological motivations that people have to associate certain sounds with certain meanings. So maybe there are things like that very distant, but at a basic level, there's no intrinsic reason why the thing that opens and shuts has to be named with the sounds d, and if you want, you can invent a new one. You can say, from now on, we're going to call it, and you could use a randomizer thing to generate the sound. Oh, it's going to be a kalunkungungungungun. Yep. And if you start saying that, that word will work just fine. So in that sense, there's something quite arbitrary about the signifier, I guess, and its relationship to what it signifies, the point it makes. But the point I'm trying to make there is, we're using a natural resource, which is the sounds we can make, but we've built on that by developing this rich system of language, such that we can have expressive powers that far exceed the simple expressive capacities of the organic body. And we can say all the amazing things that language allows us to say, and that's integral to how we let the objective world that we live in, how we get it to come into existence, right? Those become we develop the resources for, in an extremely rich way, articulating a shared world, and especially a universally shared world. Um, uh, I wanted to just make one more point, and so, um, uh, but anyway, I was talking about how gestures uh, invite the learner to participate, and for the child, how the cultural objects do that too. I wanted to say something about art now, because art is pretty much that same kind of thing. Dewey, in his book Art as Experience, it seems to me, does a particularly good job of talking about this kind of point, that uh, artworks are expressive in the sense we've just been talking about. And actually, I said Dewey. I could also have said Hegel. Hegel's lectures on fine art similarly make this point, that um, art, cultures develop histories of a certain kind of artwork. And at a basic level, uh, when you look through the history of the development of art, what's happening in a culture's art largely is the expression of that culture's way of being in the world, that shared form of cultural worldly inhabitation. And the artworks were, in a way, giving voice to the world those people found themselves in. And it was partially through making those works that they were able to tell themselves who they were and what we were doing. Right? And that was the point that I was starting with when I was talking about language, right? About the question we are to ourselves, then the indeterminacy of our experience, and the effort we have to put into to come up with it, to realize a kind of determinate sense of that. Well, artworks are like that, right? Artworks are an attempt to say what something is, but they don't say it in language in the sense we're used to talking about language, because the sense we're used to talking about language in is second order speech, where all the words match up with things, right? You can't do that because you don't have that language there when you're trying to initiate your articulation. So art is the initial way to try to express what the world is, and through those acts of expression, we get a sense of it, and then we build on that, and things develop. But so artworks in general, what really makes them art is that they offer you a kind of experience. They show you something that you could participate in. And Dewey in particular has a very nice account of how that works. I think it's in chapter 7, called The Natural History of Form. He has a very, very nice discussion of the workings of artwork, and then I think in the final chapter, I can't remember what number it is, 12 or 15 or something, he does talk about the history of it, and talks about the way that these historical works express something, and it's not secret in the same way that somebody's expression of anger is not secret, right? Those works did express something, and that's why it's possible for other people to let themselves be shown the same experiences by those things. Anyway, so I just want to talk about gesture and trace out gesture in relationship to learning, and that notion of the inaugural character. But, gestures can be second order, just like everyday language can be second order. And we're very familiar with those things. But what I really wanted to focus on was that whole activity of inauguration, whether it happens in the loving gestures you express to the child, whether it happens in the engagement of the child with the cultural objects, whether it happens in the words of a couple that's about to be formed when they tell each other they love each other, or whether it happens in the artwork that introduces a kind of experience that doesn't have another way to express itself and can't be as yet shown in any other way than through this work. And yet through the work, a new experience becomes possible. And then once you inhabit that new way of experiencing, you gradually learn more ways of expressing it, and you start to develop what would eventually become something like second order language use. So that's where I'm going to stop the thing I'm saying there, because I really just wanted to talk about gestures and start with pointing, and then run it around to that idea of the way that gestures are the body acting as the expression of my experience as something to be shared, and through that notion of the shared body scheme and so on, like this idea that our experience is in principle to be shared, and that's what we can take up from another person's gesture. gestures essentially say you should experience this too, and so someone else tries to. And I wanted to pick that theme up then all the way from those most immediate little bodily expressions of intimate of intimacy with the child and the older person and so on, uh, through all the ways that we learn and grow up. Ultimately, in talking about art, really, and cultural objects, trying to get to the idea that you know we grow up into a shared sense of the world too, right? And so going back to the earliest talk about the habit body and so on, I've been trying to talk about how we don't just have this sort of detached cognitive experience of a mind looking at an object, right? That experience that reflective experience we're familiar with is rests upon this massive buildup of a shared world that comes through the process of habituation that has its roots in the bodily interaction with the environment. And so I want to focus now on this notion of language as ultimately the kind of the last word on that, right? The world we're growing up into. Remember, I said I want to be doing a phenomenology of our experience of others, right? Well, so that's really what we're at. The world we're growing up into is a world with others, right? And language is the medium in which that world with others is established and realized. And language really just is a refined and developed version of our body as an expression. So in a way, it is the body as the promise of shared experience and as the invitation to shared experience that is, in a way, the foundation, for lack of a better term, of our shared world. And yeah, so obviously there's lots more to say about sharing worlds, lots more to say about experience of others, and so on. But that's really what I wanted to get to. That's what I wanted to bring out of the chapter on the body as expression and speech, and pair it up with that stuff about sex, just as a way of bringing out the bodily reality, the bodily character of our experience with others. Or also, I could put it the other way around, bringing out the idea that um, it's not just that our experience with others happens bodily. It's also that our experience of our own bodies is always a matter of engaging with other people, right? So I wanted to bring those themes out, and basically that's where I want to end my discussion of Merleau-Ponty and the Phenomenology of the Body and of this book. I had initially imagined ending here, but I think I am going to do one last final lecture, which is going to be on Heidegger's essay, The Question Concerning Technology, because I think that's would be a kind of a nice way to end, given the whole set of things we have done. So that will be the final thing, and that's what will come next.